Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming. Chapters 421 through 430 of the previous episode. Qian Ping'an arrives in the capital of Southern Garden Nation, finding himself in a bizarre, papier-mâché city where residents trade in fake currency. After accidentally breaking a local taboo, he meets a spirit, a former mountain lord, who reveals the city's tragic history. Meanwhile, Lu Tai continues to haunt Qian's path, eventually guiding him to the Flying Eagle Fortress to investigate a demonic plot involving a ghost infant and the fortress lord's wife. Qian uncovers the demonic scheme and after a fierce struggle, neutralizes the threat, saving the fortress from mass slaughter. Grateful for his help, the locals reward him, though Qian keeps his humble demeanor. Departing the fortress, he resumes his journey towards Stalactite Mountain. His path eventually leads him to a strange wine shop, where he meets a mysterious couple who seem to know him. After sharing drinks and stories, he continues his trek, unknowingly leaving behind a trail of deep impressions on both allies and enemies alike. If you're able to, please support me on PayPal to help me stay active. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 431. There were several small bookshops on Champion Scholar Alley, and aside from selling books, there were also some crude sets of 4 treasures of the study available for purchase. Thankfully, they weren't very expensive. After all, the customers of these bookshops were primarily impoverished scholars who had come to the capital city to sit the imperial examination, and Qian Ping'an purchased a few travel journals from one of the bookshops. He wasn't going to read the travel journals anytime soon. Instead, he had purchased them to add to the collection on Downtrodden Mountain. As Qian Ping'an returned to the alley where he was staying, the little boy also just so happened to return from his lessons. The two of them walked down the alley side by side, and the boy seemed to want to tell Qian Ping'an something, but was unable to muster up the courage to do so. Qian Ping'an pretended to be oblivious to the boy's dilemma. Upon returning to the house, he had dinner with the boy's family that night. According to the rental agreement, the family had to supply meals to Qian Ping'an for an additional cost of 30 copper coins per day. The old woman had promised him that every meal was going to have some form of fish or meat, but Qian Ping'an was often absent, either going out too early for breakfast and returning too late for dinner, or disappearing for a few days at a time altogether, and the old woman was very pleased to see this. For this meal, there was no meat on the table, and the old woman smiled and apologized, telling Qian Ping'an that if he had told her earlier that he would be joining them for dinner, then she would have prepared more ingredients. Qian Ping'an wasn't bothered, telling her that he was satisfied as long as there was enough food to fill his belly. The old woman asked him what his plans for the next day were, and upon hearing that he was going out again, she heaved a forlorn sigh, complaining about how busy he was and all the meals that he was missing. She also told him that her daughter-in-law was quite a good cook, and that she didn't dare to promise fine dining, but hearty meals were definitely guaranteed. The woman had her face buried in her bowl, eating only rice without even daring to touch the dishes on the table, and she looked up slightly with a bashful smile on her face. It was certainly not every day that she received praise from her mother-in-law. Occasionally, a wealthy young master would pass by on horseback, or a renowned brothel worker would saunter elegantly through the area, and whenever this happened, they would instantly become the center of attention. Qian Ping'an was sitting not far away from the go board, which was surrounded by a large crowd, and the boy suddenly approached him with his own stool before sitting down beside him. Qian Ping'an had left lasting qi in his room, as it would have attracted far too much attention to be walking around with a sword on his back. He was carrying his sword-nurturing gourd with him, but he had left the more obedient 15th back at the courtyard to keep a lookout in case lasting qi was stolen. At the moment, there was a great deal of unrest brewing in the capital city, and things were most likely going to come to a head very soon. Qian Ping'an could sense that the boy had something on his mind, and he smiled as he asked, "Is there something bothering you?" The boy had learned some etiquette from school, and he lowered his head in apology as he said, "I'm sorry, young Master Qian." "What for?" Qian Ping'an asked. The boy sat on his stool with his tightly clenched fists resting on his knees, not daring to look at Qian Ping'an as he replied, "My mother often goes to rummage through your stuff while you're away." Qian Ping'an was rather taken aback to hear this. He had thought that it was the cruel old woman who was always going through his things, and he wasn't expecting the culprit to be the boy's mother, who appeared far more humble and timid. The boy lowered his head even further as he continued. During one of your longer absences, my mother took the books that you had on your table, and I couldn't help myself, so I read them. I know what I did wasn't right. Chen Ping'an was about to tell the boy that it was all right, but he quickly changed his mind and instead replied, "You're correct in thinking that what you did was wrong." While visiting a temple fair on one of his strolls through the capital city, Chen Ping'an saw a woman and her son, both of whom were dressed in fine clothing, and they were followed by a group of alert servants. The boy was about 5 or 6 years old, and he spotted a beautiful young woman at a stall, so he rushed over to tug on the woman's sleeve. The boy harbored no ill will toward the young woman, and he merely wanted to grab her attention. Initially, the young woman paid no heed to him, but having had a privileged upbringing where he was used to being showered with attention, the boy was very disgruntled at being ignored, so he began to tug on the young woman's sleeve with more and more force. The young woman began to feel a little annoyed, but instead of getting angry at the child, she turned to the boy's mother, who called out for him to come back to her side and to stop bothering the young woman. If that had been the end of the story, then that sequence of events would have quickly slipped out of Chen Ping'an's mind. However, at the time, the boy's mother had said something that Chen Ping'an had felt like was incorrect, but he was unable to place his finger on exactly why he felt this way. In order to discipline her son, the woman had said, "Stop being so naughty. You're making that big sister over there mad." At first glance, there seemed to be no problem. The woman was stern, yet still benevolent with her son, and she certainly didn't display any animosity toward the young woman either. Only now, as Chen Ping'an was chatting with the little boy, did he finally understand what was wrong with that interaction. It was similar to the tragedy that had befallen Song Yuxiao of Watercombing Nation, but was also somewhat different. The way that the woman had educated her son was incorrect. Was the boy not at fault if the young woman at the stall didn't get mad? Compared with the tragedy that had befallen Song Yuxiao, it seemed was just a completely insignificant event that could be brushed off without a second thought. In fact, if one were to pursue this matter and insist on taking the objectively correct course of action, they would definitely be accused of trying to make something out of nothing. Perhaps the woman would feel insulted and become defensive about her son's actions, and even the young woman by the stall may not be thankful for the interjection. Chen Ping'an pulled out his bamboo slip, and his gaze slowly roamed down its length, where many notches had already been scratched into its sides. Chen Ping'an held the ruler-like bamboo slip aloft between his right and left index fingers, then turned to the nervous boy with a smile as he said, "Your mother was definitely wrong to have done this, and you're also somewhat at fault for going along with what she did, but you have to understand that there are magnitudes when it comes to right and wrong. Unless we're talking about matters that concern major matters of principles, there is an element of human emotion to almost everything. For example, your mother only did this as she wants you to read more books so that you can become a scholar and perhaps even do well in the imperial examination in the future. Your mother is someone who's endured a great deal of hardship, and she's certainly not doing this for her own benefit. Instead, all she wants is a better future for you. If you understand why your mother did what she did, then you don't have to think too much about it. Once you're aware of her faults and everything that she's done for you, then what you do next is up to you. You've read some books now, and you've seen the principles in those books, so you've learned etiquette. If you could go back in time and do things over again, what would you do?" The boy was listening very earnestly, and the principles espoused by Chen Ping'an weren't overly complex. On top of that, he was quite a smart boy, so he was able to understand Chen Ping'an, and after some careful contemplation he replied, "I should have returned the books that my mother took back to your room, then openly requested to borrow your books to read. Is that the right thing to do?" Chen Ping'an nodded in response. "All I can say is that this is already enough for me, but if someone else were in my place, then you may have to think a bit more about it." The boy was ecstatic to hear this and he asked, "Does that mean you forgive my mother, young Master Chen?" Chen Ping'an patted the boy on his little head as he replied, "Some faults can be made up for, and that's exactly what you've done." The boy nodded vigorously in response. "Our teacher told us that the ability to learn from and make up for our mistakes is a great virtue." Even in battles of life and death, Chen Ping'an was a man of few words, yet he had said so much to a child, and even he felt a little surprised by how talkative a mood he was in. However, after getting all of this off his chest, he was now in a much calmer mental state, and he felt as if he could resume his walking and standing meditation right away without any problems. Chan Ping'an stowed the bamboo slip back up his sleeve, then continued. We must eat every day in order to survive. If we are so fortunate as to not have to worry about food and shelter, we have time to read books and learn principles of life, but not necessarily because we wish to become sagely figures. Instead, it's only to make our lives a little better. Of course, reading and learning may not necessarily change our lives for the better, but at the very least, the principles passed down by sages and virtuous figures throughout the years tell us the best ways to avoid making mistakes, and how best to live our lives in order to maintain peace of mind. A perplexed look appeared on the boy's face and he said, I'm afraid you've lost me there, young Master Chan. Chan Ping'an smiled as he replied, Truth be told, there are many things that even I haven't figured out for myself yet. It's just like building a house. At the moment I only have a few pillars set up, and the house is far from complete, so there's no need to take what I say too seriously, and it doesn't really matter if you understand or not. If you have any questions that you can't figure out the answers to in the future, you can take them to your teachers at school. The boy smiled as he rose to his feet, then picked up his little stool and extended a bow toward Chan Ping'an. He then told Chan Ping'an that he had to go home to transcribe some books. According to him, his teacher was very strict, and any form of slacking off would be sure to result in physical punishment. Chan Ping'an smiled as he waved a dismissive hand. Following the boy's departure, Chan Ping'an remained seated as he suddenly said, Drop the rock. A brief silence ensued, following which the sound of a rock clattering to the ground rang out, and it sounded like it was quite a large one. An emaciated little girl then dusted off her hands before casually making her way over to Chan Ping'an's side, and she squatted down as she asked, Can you lend me your stool? Chan Ping'an paid no heed to her as he removed the sword-nurturing gourd from his waist and began drinking from it. You're clearly very rich. Can you give me some of your money? Didn't you just say that we need to eat every day in order to survive? Without money to buy food, I could starve to death any day now, the little girl said. Chan Ping'an didn't even look at her as he asked, How did you find me? The little girl ignored his question as she put on a pitiable expression and continued, I know you have a lot of money. You could easily spare me a few taels of silver, and it wouldn't matter to you, but I'd be able to buy a lot of pancakes and steamed buns with that money. During winter, a bunch of old beggars always freeze to death in the capital every year, and if I want to make it through the winter, I have to peel the clothes off their bodies after they die. That's where the clothes that I'm wearing now came from. If I had some money, I'd definitely be able to make it through the winter. Chan Ping'an continued to look away from her as he asked, Where are the clothes that you were wearing last time? They were given to you by that little girl you tried to kill, right? Why aren't you wearing them today? Are you intentionally wearing more tattered clothes just to come and see me? The little girl put on an innocent facade, seemingly having completely failed to understand what Chan Ping'an was implying as she replied, These tattered clothes are better to wear during summer because they keep me cool. I usually only save the clothes that she gave me for winter, as they're the only warm clothes that I have. All of a sudden, Chan Ping'an rose to his feet, then looked both ways up and down the street as he said to the little girl, Go and stand next to the wall, and no matter what happens next, don't make a sound. The little girl was very crafty, and she had been secretly observing Chan Ping'an this entire time. Following Chan Ping'an's lead, she also took a glance up and down the street, then grumbled something under her breath as she rose to her feet. Yet right as she was about to rush over to the wall to avoid whatever trouble was coming, Chan Ping'an instructed, Take the stool with you. Why should I listen to you? She asked in a disgruntled manner. Are you my father? I'll give you 10 copper coins, Chan Ping'an replied in a concise fashion. A bright smile immediately appeared on the little girl's face, and she picked up the little stool before rushing away as she said, All right, whatever you say, father. There were two people walking toward each other from either end of the paved street, and Chan Ping'an and the go-board were situated right in between them. To Chan Ping'an's left was a woman with a white veil over her face. She was wearing a green robe with a silken red outer garment and a jade belt around her waist. There was a lute held in her arms, and she was walking along in a seductive fashion. To Chan Ping'an's right was a man around 8 feet tall. His upper body was completely bare to reveal a muscular physique, but he was wearing a pair of pink pants. These two looked completely out of place in contrast with the residents of the local area. The brawny man's eyes were filled with killing intent, and he made no attempt to conceal his intentions whatsoever as he stared intently at Qian Ping'an. Despite Qian Ping'an's harmless appearance, the man knew better than to judge his opponents based on outward appearances, and he declared, "Outsider, my name is Ma Xian, and I come from outside the city. Some people like to call me Pink Vajra, and yesterday I was offered 1,000 taels of gold for your head. I was told that you're an unfathomably powerful martial artist, and that despite your youthful appearance, there's a very good chance that you're Yu Zheni, so I called up that woman to come with me. If you put an end to your own life here, then you'll be able to die in one piece. Otherwise, I'll have to pummel you to bits with my fists." The man was extremely loud, and the entire street was buzzing from his thunderous voice. Everyone that was gathered around the go board hurriedly fled in a panic. A murder was about to take place under broad daylight, and there was no way they were going to stay and watch. According to the older generation living on Champion Scholar Alley, several battles between powerful martial artists had taken place in the past in Southern Garden Nation's capital city, and each of those battles had resulted in a tremendous amount of collateral damage. Several entire sections of the city had been razed to the ground, and at least several hundred households were partially or entirely killed. A faint smile appeared woman's face as she watched the fleeing bystanders through her thin veil, and she was just about to strum the strings of her lute with her right hand to decapitate Qian Ping'an with a musical note, but she suddenly stopped what she was doing as she said, "If you don't wish to hear my music, then I suppose I'll have to hold off for now." She and Ma Xian were romantic partners, and she was here to earn the 1,000 taels of gold with him, not to put herself in harm's way by pitting herself in direct battle against their target. The only reason why she had agreed to come was because the two of them formed a perfect partnership, which was very rare in the martial arts world. Ma Xian would be responsible for close-quarters combat, while she assisted him from afar, and they complemented each other perfectly. As long as they weren't facing any one of the upper 10 elites, they would at least be able to get away even if they couldn't defeat their target. Qian Ping'an was feeling a little perplexed, and he couldn't help but wonder why he was being targeted. First, it was Fan Wanner, who had approached him out of the blue to ask if he was a so-called otherworldly immortal, and now someone was paying 1,000 taels of gold for his head. It was clear that these two had no qualms about killing innocents, and if he hadn't stopped them, they would have most likely already killed all of the fleeing bystanders. While Ma Xian was by far the more physically imposing of the two, more of Qian Ping'an's attention was focused on the woman. Her lute was entirely crafted out of purple sandalwood, and Qian Ping'an could see that there was more to it than met the eye. In particular, there were traces of blood and inky black deathly energy intertwined near the strings of the lute, and they were slowly spreading outward in all directions. However, there were no vengeful spirits or malicious ghosts taking shape around the lute, and that was rather strange to Qian Ping'an. Given his past experience, he expected to see some paranormal signs around the lute, given that it had claimed so many lives and accumulated so much resentment. The emaciated little girl was seated on the stool at the foot of the wall, quietly repeating the phrase, "No one can see me," to herself over and over again. As for why she hadn't fled like the other bystanders in the alley, she had considered that option, but she felt safer staying in close proximity to Qian Ping'an. "If I give you 2,000 taels of gold, will you tell me who instructed you to do this?" Qian Ping'an asked. The woman lowered her head with a seductive smile, and as she was holding her lute in her arms, her chest was squeezed even more forcefully against the back of her lute as a result of this gesture. Ma Xian immediately turned his gaze to her with a look of fiery desire in his eyes, and he scoffed, "You horny slut, you're still just as susceptible to handsome men as you've always been. Let's find a place to do it after we finish things up here. Can you charge a little less this time? 100 taels of gold a pop is way too expensive." "So there's no possibility for negotiation?" Qian Ping'an sighed. "Sure there is." The brawny man chuckled as he continued to approach Qian Ping'an. "Once I've twisted your head off, I'll tell you anything that you want to know." Meanwhile, the woman stopped around 100 meters away from Qian Ping'an, then began to gently flex her wrists in preparation for battle. All of a sudden, Ma Xian launched himself forward, shattering the ground beneath his feet. In the blink of an eye, he was no more than 10 feet away from Qian Ping'an, and so fast was his speed of movement that his pink pants were flapping audibly while pressing themselves tightly against his legs. With only 10 feet of distance separating them, Qian Ping'an hadn't moved in the slightest, and it was as if he had been completely rooted to the spot from fear. A sinister grin appeared on Ma Xian's face as he scoffed. "This is what you get for making my woman go into heat." He swung a fist at Qian Pingan's head with tremendous force as he spoke, and in response Qian Pingan arched back gently to avoid the blow, while his feet remained firmly rooted to the ground. At the same time, he was thinking to himself that this Ma Xian was acting a little too cocky by speaking during battle. Was he not afraid of being struck by his opponent during the interval between breaths? As soon as Qian Pingan evaded his punch, Ma Xian immediately knew that he was in trouble, and he instantly spread his qi throughout his entire body. Even though he was renowned for his physical prowess, it was still always better to be safe than sorry, and he was worried that his body may not be able to withstand the retaliative strike from his opponent. Hence, he immediately abandoned offense for defense, focusing all of his efforts on defending himself. As his qi traveled through his acupoints, his skin began to glow a radiant golden color. Qian Pingan aimed a kick upward, striking Ma Xian in the abdomen to launch him up into the sky. From there, Qian Pingan abruptly stood up straight again, then dodged to the left and the right in quick succession to evade the 4 lute strings that were sweeping toward him from afar. The woman's right hand was flying over the strings of her lute in a barely visible blur, but the lute produced no sound. Instead, it was releasing strings of translucent light that swept through the air with lethal force. Qian Pingan drifted along the street like a leaf in the wind, managing to evade all of the oncoming lute threads just in the nick of time. These threads of light were sweeping through the air without any rhyme or reason, like arrows being fired by dozens of powerful bows, and they were converging toward Qian Pingan from all directions. Meanwhile, Ma Xian plummeted to the ground, using his downward momentum to slam his fists down onto the street with tremendous force. The woman had been keeping an eye on Ma Xian this entire time, and right as he landed on the ground, the flurry of strings of light being released from her lute ceased so that she didn't interrupt the flow of his attack. All of a sudden, Qian Pingan vanished from the spot. Ma Xian faltered slightly upon seeing this, but it was too late for him to arrest the momentum of his fists, and they slammed heavy down onto the street. Ma Xian was half knelt onto the ground, and his fists sent shattered rocks flying in all directions. In the next instant, Qian Pingan appeared beside Ma Xian and placed a hand onto his shoulder, then only exerted a slight amount of force, and both of Ma Xian's knees instantly sank into the bluestone street. Ma Xian let loose a furious roar as he attempted to resist against the tremendous force being exerted through Qian Pingan's hand, but Qian Pingan merely pressed down a little more firmly, and he was forced down onto his backside. The golden coloration of his skin that signified his unmatched physical constitution began to fade away on its own, while his aura also began to circulate in his body in an unstable fashion against his will, and a horrified look instantly appeared on his face. Through the initial phase of the battle, Qian Pingan had noticed something, which was that Ma Xian's true qi was too loose and scattered. His aura and fist intent were both truly formidable, and his martial arts cultivation base was also nothing to be scoffed at, but in a sense, he was like a house built upon low-quality wooden support beams. On calm and pleasant days with light winds, there wouldn't be any problems, but during heavy storms the house could easily collapse. His true qi was scattered and chaotic. He had clearly valued quantity over quality in his accumulation of true qi, and it wasn't pure at all. He was a martial artist, yet it was as if he had gone down the qi refiner route. The woman stopped playing her lute altogether as she heaved a faint sigh. There was a vast disparity in power, and it was clear that she and Ma Xian had bitten off far more than they could chew. There was a very good chance that this white-robed outsider was a martial arts master who was infinitely approaching the upper 10 elites. Was he a martial artist aligned with the demonic forces? Had another exceptional prodigy emerged in the wake of old Demon Ding to unify the martial artist world? Alternatively, could he be a secret disciple of Yu Zhanyi's, painstakingly nurtured for the purpose of taking down old Demon Ding? The situation had completely spiraled out of control, and the woman was at a complete loss for what to do. She and Ma Xian should have never gotten involved in this matter. Right at this moment, the sound of applause rang out from on top of the wall. Impressive. As expected of someone who was placed on the list on a last-minute basis. It looks like I'll have to take this seriously. The woman looked up, and she fell even further into the depths of despair. Squatting on top of the wall was a man with a stiff smile. It was an expression that never changed, as if he were wearing a crude mask that had taken root on his face and would remain there for the rest of his life. It was smiley-faced Qiantang. Outside of the upper 10 elites, Qiantang was considered to be the martial arts master most difficult to deal with. He was a very enigmatic martial artist who was aligned with the demonic forces, and he didn't often engage in senseless slaughter of innocents, but if he were to encounter a martial artist of the same caliber as himself, then he would be sure to pester them to no end. Among the previous generation of the upper 10 elites was a man known as Eight-Armed Deity Shui Yuan. Due to his advanced age, he was past his prime and had fallen out of the upper 10 elites, but he was still a force to be reckoned with, and a certain martial arts master of the 3 devilish sects had almost perished to his fist techniques. However, even Shui Yuan was harassed by Qiantang for an entire year, and was almost driven insane as a result. Qiantang was squatting on top of the wall, and he grabbed a handful of dirt before casually tossing it forward as he chuckled. If you're still intentionally holding back, then you're going to end up dead, not by his hands but by mine. Your name was Ma Xian, right? And you there, the woman with the big tits. What was your name again? All of a sudden, a tremendous aura erupted out of Ma Xian's body, one that was far more powerful than before. At the same time, the woman had also put on a set of fake nails that were giving off a faint gleam, and she was clearly no longer holding back as she urgently strummed the strings of her lute. Ma Xian threw a vicious punch at Chen Ping'an, who raised a hand to block the punch, and he used the force of the punch to glide back along the street, with his feet sliding over the ground like a pair of ghost stones. At the same time, a pair of thin strings of green light passed through the area in between Ma Xian and Chen Ping'an before slicing deep into the wall on the other side of the alley. If Chen Ping'an had retreated just a moment too late, then he would have been forced to face this surprise attack. Ma Xian turned to take a glance at Qiantang, who was still squatting on the wall, then harumphed coldly as he turned his gaze back to the unscathed Chen Ping'an before spitting up a mouthful of blood onto the ground. He had already sustained some internal injuries to his organs from that kick to the abdomen from Chen Ping'an, and he said to the woman behind him, "It's going to be very difficult for us to make it out alive unless we go all out here. This is all your fault." The woman spat through gritted teeth. "There are countless easier ways to earn 1,000 taels of silver. How was I supposed to know that this would be such a difficult job? Everyone had agreed to take on old Demon Ding together, and I thought this guy was just a small fry," Ma Xian countered with a grimace. Meanwhile, most of Chen Ping'an's attention was placed on Qiantang. He was testing them, trying to see just how deep the water here was, and all of them were trying to determine exactly what Chen Ping'an was capable of. Qiantang began clapping once again as he said, "How interesting. It looks like great minds do think alike." Right at this moment, a handsome young man emerged from a crossroads, carrying a pair of bloody heads. It was Zhou Shi, and he stood at the crossroads, looking at Chen Ping'an from afar. He smiled as he raised the heads that he was holding, then casually tossed them onto the ground. From behind him emerged an extremely beautiful woman wearing a pair of wooden clogs. She made her way around Zhou Shi, and as she stepped onto the paved street, her clogs began to clack against the bluestone material. She was also holding a pair of heads, which she casually tossed onto the street as well. A faint smile then appeared on her face as she said, "Greetings, young master. My grandteacher says that this boy can live as long as you hand over that wine gourd of yours. Otherwise, their family of 5 will be reunited on the other side. You've been exploring the capital city extensively over the past few months, and you're clearly a very kind-hearted person. Surely you wouldn't just stand by and watch an innocent child be killed when you could change that outcome." Inside the house deep in the alley, old Demon Ding was seated on a stool, basking in the light of the sun. Beside him was a boy trembling uncontrollably with snot and tears flowing down his face. The old man smiled as he said, "There's no need to be afraid, child. You possess exceptional aptitude, and I'm planning to make an exception and take you as my disciple. Perhaps you could become the leader of the demonic orthodoxy, so what's there to cry about? You've lost some family, but you now have the chance to rule over an entire world. You've read some books, so you should be aware of which is more valuable out of the two. If you keep crying and diverting my attention, I may not be able to keep that little guy trapped in that room, and if that happens, I'll have to kill you as well." He then cast his gaze toward the distance as he said, "Eugenie Zhongqiu, let me tell you this now. Zhou Fei has already promised to help me, so I suggest that you kill Tong Qingqing and Feng Qingbai first, then come back to fight me. Also, the emergence of that outsider is a huge opportunity, so it's no longer really that important whether you kill me or not. Do you really think I would be lured in by a golden arhat body? If that's the case, then you think far too little of me. Having said that, I can tell you a huge piece of good news. If you kill that man on the street, then it'll no longer be 10. With his life, in addition to that wine gourd and the immortal flying sword in the room behind me, it'll at least be 13. How about all of us adjust our strategies? If we kill that kid, many more choices will become available to us. After a brief silence, the old man seemed to have received a response, and he gave a cold sneer. On the street, Chen Ping'an inspected his surroundings momentarily, then declared, "There's no need to try and get a grasp on my mental state." Everyone was rather perplexed, wondering why he had suddenly said something. In the distance, a middle-aged man was standing under the shade of a tree with a sword held to his chest. He had been taking a nap this entire time, but his eyes suddenly sprang open, and he was completely alert as he remarked to himself with a cold smile, "I knew it." The middle-aged man slowly emerged from the shade of the tree, and he grabbed onto the hilt of his sword with its blade pointing upward, wobbling from side to side. As opposed to a swordsman, he looked much more like a naughty child playing with a rattle drum. However, as soon as he stepped into view, everyone's expressions instantly changed drastically. The man paid no heed to all of these vast renowned martial artists, and his gaze was fixed solely on Chen Ping'an as he smiled and said, "You're thinking far too highly of yourself. In the next century, Ding Ying is probably the only one worthy of being hunted by me. As for you, you're still nowhere near worthy of that honor yet." Everyone looked on as the man plunged his sword into the ground, and he rested his hands lazily onto the tip of the sword's hilt as he turned to everyone else with a smile and said, "Well, don't just stand there. Keep going. I'll only step in if all of you are unable to get the job done. Rest assured, my sword is reserved only for that boy today, and I won't target any of you." Ma Xian spat up a globule of bloody saliva, then smiled as he said, "I never thought that I would have the opportunity to be backed up by Sword Immortal Lu. Looks like it was worth making this trip to the capital after all. Regardless of the outcome, my name will inevitably be mentioned whenever someone speaks of this battle, and that's enough for me." Ma Xian huddled over slightly, and a fearsome tiger tattoo appeared over his body, stretching all the way from his shoulder down the entire length of his arm. On top of that, a door-god-like image had also appeared on his muscular back. It depicted an azure-robed man with a head of long hair, wielding a long saber. The man's eyes were closed, and he was giving off a cold aura that was even more formidable than that of the tiger tattoo. Qian Tang's smile widened even further, and he plucked out a piece of straw from somewhere, then began to gently chew on it. Meanwhile, Zhou Shi said in a quiet voice, "It looks like Ma Xian has stumbled upon some type of fated opportunity. My father tells me that this is a deity invitation technique, and someone was able to use this same technique in that battle outside the capital 300 years ago to great effect, hunting down 2,000 elite grassland cavalry and wiping out every single one of them." Upon catching sight of the peculiar look in the lute-wielding woman's eyes, Ma Xian smiled as he said, "I wouldn't have dared to take on this job if I didn't have some new tricks up my sleeve. Do you really think I care about the gold on offer?" A hint of mockery flashed through Ma Xian's eyes as he scoffed. "You haven't really fallen for that impoverished scholar? All scholars care about their reputation. If he learns about your past, he's going to be kicking himself, and he'll definitely denounce you for being a prostitute and a whore. And you know what? He'd be right. Which part of your body is clean? Keep lying to yourself. When you and that impoverished scholar get married, I'll give you 500 taels of gold as your prostitution fee." I sense genuine love and affection behind those scathing words. Zhou Shi chuckled. A hesitant look appeared on the face of the lute-wielding woman. All of a sudden, Qian Tang interjected, "You're planning to marry him? Prior to coming here, I had a chat with that scholar and we hit it off really well. We talked about many interesting stories that we'd heard, and one of those stories was the one about the lute woman." The idiot immediately began denouncing the lute woman for her actions, referring to her as a shameless whore. But little does he know that he's talking about the very same woman that sleeps beside him every night. "I think a marriage between the two of you would work." Given his sheer stupidity, You could easily keep your identity from him, a secret for the rest of your life. A look of melancholy appeared on the woman's face, but it was then immediately replaced by one of resolve. Chen Ping'an had been listening and observing this entire time without displaying any agitation. Not only was he currently surrounded, it seemed that 15th had been trapped in the house where he had been staying. The lackadaisical swordsman that had just stepped out from under the shade of the tree was the third martial artist that Chen Ping'an had encountered that was displaying signs of approaching the Great Tao, with the previous two being the old man in the lotus flower hat and Fan Wanner. However, this man's martial arts cultivation base was far superior to Fan Wanner's, and it seemed that he wasn't far away from the old man with the Ding surname. On top of that, even Ma Xian had some trump cards up his sleeve, and it was clear that the water here was deeper than it appeared on the surface. If he had kept 15th in his sword nurturing gourd instead of first, then he would be in a slightly better situation right now, but there was no point in thinking about that now. This seemed like a truly dire situation. Zhou Shi smiled as he said, "I'll let you do the honors, Monsieur. I was put up to this by my grandteacher, so I certainly wouldn't dare to slack off. Having said that, remember to save me if I'm in danger." Yer replied in a resigned manner. Zhou Shi nodded in response. "There's no loss more tragic than that of a beautiful woman. Rest assured, I won't let you down." Qian Tang tossed the straw that he was chewing on aside, and he also rose to his feet. After doing some stretching, a genuine smile far less stiff and rigid than his normal smile appeared on his face as he said, "It's not every day that I get to fight an otherworldly immortal." Lu Feng smiled as he cautioned, "Stop thinking about such useless things on the cusp of a battle. Tong Qingqing Feng Qingbai, and you all have similar levels of talent when it comes to the martial arts, and the three of you all live your lives in different ways, but you have the least luck out of the bunch. I know that you've been concealing your true power all this time. That's a very dangerous game akin to playing with fire, and you may just get burned if you're not careful." Ma Xian had already elevated himself to the peak of his powers in one fell swoop, and there was no reason for him to wait any longer. It wasn't clear whether the resentment and affection that he felt toward the woman with the lute was genuine, but his battle intent was definitely genuine. The tiger tattoo was moving as if it were a living creature, and a burst of golden light appeared over his shoulder arm, to the point that golden radiance was even spilling through the gaps between his fingers. He stepped forward and arrived in front of Chen Ping'an in an instant, then threw a punch forward with tremendous force. Instead of retreating, Chen Ping'an advanced forward as he lowered his center of gravity while ducking his head to the side, just barely evading Ma Xian's fist while also blocking Ma Xian's knee strike with his right hand. With a firm push, Ma Xian was sent flying back 70 to 80 feet before stumbling back a few more steps, stomping several craters into the ground. The sound of the woman's lute rang out, and two bright threads of light swept directly toward Chen Ping'an from either side of Ma Xian, who stomped his foot forcefully into the ground to launch himself forward once again. Chen Ping'an was able to evade the oncoming lute strings with ease, and not only was he extremely agile, he was abnormally fast, as if there were something tugging on him, allowing him to change directions at an inconceivable speed. Lu Feng's eyes lit up as he yelled, "Ma Xian, look out in front of you!" Ma Xian instantly stopped cold in his tracks, doing so with such tremendous force that his feet plowed a pair of trenches into the ground, and he raised his arms to form a barrier in front of himself. Sure enough, a punch came out of nowhere to strike him on the arm, and he let loose a thunderous roar, upon which the azure-robed door god on his back abruptly opened its eyes. Ma Xian leaned back slightly from the force of the punch, then stepped forward as he swung his fist through the air, and the golden light radiating from his entire arm left a radiant golden sector in its wake. From the perspective of Qian Tang, he saw Chen Ping'an gently press down onto Ma Xian's fist with one hand, then launch himself up into the air, vaulting over Ma Xian's head. From there, he trod onto the back of Ma Xian's head, launching himself at the woman with the lute hiding behind him. The woman strummed her fingers rapidly over the strings of her lute in response, releasing a series of strings of light that intertwined to form a green net in Chen Ping'an's path. All of a sudden, Chen Ping'an's brow furrowed slightly as he abruptly changed directions, abandoning the woman with the lute as he darted away to his left, toward Qian Tang. Aside from Lu Feng, Qian Tang was the one who Chen Ping'an was most wary of. "Aren't you supposed to be going after the easy targets? You're taking the complete opposite route." Qiantang chuckled as he spread open his arms before falling backward. In the next instant, he abruptly vanished into thin air, and Qian Ping'an swiveled around to reach out toward Qiantang, who had somehow appeared behind him and was swinging a kick right at the back of Qian Ping'an's head. Qian Ping'an's hand grasped onto nothing but empty air as Qiantang vanished once again, as if he were using land-shortening talismans. For a second time, he appeared behind Qian Ping'an without any warning, and this time, his body was curled up slightly as he spread both arms open and lashed out at Qian Ping'an's temples with his fists. Right as Qian Ping'an was about to retaliate, Lu Feng warned in a clairvoyant-like manner, "Look out, Qiantang, he's about to really fight back now." Qiantang hesitated slightly, then voluntarily abandoned his attack, even though it seemed like he was passing up a golden opportunity, and in the blink of an eye, he was standing back on the street. The two of them had just about changed positions, with Qian Ping'an standing atop the wall, while Qiantang was standing on the street. He took a glance at Lu Feng, who had foiled his plans twice in succession, and he asked, "Why don't you just attack me?" Lu Feng patted the hilt of his sword with a smile as he replied, "It would be terrible for my reputation if it became known that I ganged up on a junior with so many others." Qian Ping'an offered no response. His sword-nurturing gourd had become completely still and lifeless, and his connection with First had been completely severed. Not only that, but the Dao robe that he was wearing had also been rendered ineffective. Without the Dao robe's protection, Qian Ping'an was no longer able to disregard the weapons of his opponents. However, the silver lining here was that without the restrictive effects of the Dao robe hindering his movements, his fists would only be faster, much like back when he removed the true Qi talismans that old man Yang had placed upon him. First had gone missing, 15th was trapped, and the Dao robe was now just a normal piece of clothing. In exchange, his fists had been completely freed from their bindings. Up to this point, Qian Ping'an had actually been holding back as he was very perplexed about this world, this entire city, and the so-called upper 10 elites. He still couldn't make sense of everything, but there were some things that he had to do anyway. "Don't die, Ma Xian." Once again, Lu Feng was barking instructions. Ma Xian adopted a fist stance, and at this point, both of his arms had turned golden in color. On top of that, specks of golden light were flowing out of his nostrils with each exhale. After opening its eyes, the green-robed martial sage on his back had become even more lifelike, and a speck of white light emerged from the tip of its saber, then spread through Ma Xian's entire body, and it didn't take long before his eyes were glowing with faint silver light. In his current form, he resembled a deity revered in temples, and he grinned as he said, "I was planning to take on the Imperial Preceptor Zhong with this indestructible godly body of mine, but I've been forced to unveil it early here. Come at me, boy. Give me everything you've got, and if I so much as frown, I'll concede my loss." Qian Ping'an needed no second invitation, and he launched himself forward. In this instant, everyone was struck by the illusion that the entire street had sunken several feet from the force of Qian Ping'an's stomp, and he struck Ma Xian's chest with all his might using his heavy cavalry formation-shattering technique. The green-robed martial sage image on his back was instantly shattered, and he was sent flying back through the air like a cannonball. Qian Ping'an followed along close behind, throwing another punch into Ma Xian's midsection. Ma Xian had already completely doubled over, and with this second punch, he was sent flying back toward the lute-wielding woman behind him. "Lu Feng, save me!" the woman exclaimed as her expression changed drastically, but despite her panic, she didn't retreat, nor did she try to dodge to the side. Instead, she darted forward, attempting to hide behind Ma Xian's indestructible godly body, thinking to herself that surely there was no way that Qian Ping'an would be able to punch straight through Ma Xian's body, and as soon as he was slowed down, she was certain that Lu Feng would intervene. Qian Ping'an seemed to have gleaned her thoughts, and he threw a third punch into Ma Xian's abdomen. Not only was Ma Xian's godly body completely pulverized, his silver eyes instantly turned bright red and completely bloodshot. Ma Xian crashed into the woman behind her, causing her lute to jangle erratically, and she threw up a mouthful of blood as she kicked out her legs in an alternating fashion, frantically retreating through the air. However, she was still too slow. Qian Ping'an's fist tore straight through her lute before crashing heavily into her abdomen, and he swung his fist through the air in a semicircle, twisting the woman and her destroyed lute around in midair before sending them crashing heavily into a wall. Her voluptuous body was almost completely embedded into the wall, and it was unclear whether she was dead or alive as her shattered lute fell to the ground. Meanwhile, Lu Feng continued to stand still on the spot, watching from afar with a smile on his face. Qian Tang, don't be fooled by the current speed of his punches, he can go even faster. Do not let him get close to you. If you have ranged weapons, you can give those a try, Lu Feng advised in a lackadaisical voice. Oh, by the way, the people that he wants to kill the most are actually Yur and young Master Zhou. At this point, Yur was so astonished by Qian Pingin's display of power that she couldn't even muster up the courage to enter the fray anymore. Even if she were to be reprimanded by her grandteacher, it was still a better fate than the one that Ma Xian had suffered. As for Zhou Shi, he had already decided that he was absolutely not going to get involved, and both of them were horrified by Lu Feng's casual statement. Sure enough, Qian Pingin switched directions once again, and this time he was rushing directly at Yur. Right as she was about to react, her eyes abruptly widened as a pained look appeared on her face. The wall behind her had exploded without any warning, and an extremely thin longsword had emerged. The assassin was wielding the sword with both hands, and they had struck as fast as lightning. The sword pierced straight through her back before protruding out of her abdomen, and the poor woman was pushed forward involuntarily as the assassin continued to charge toward Qian Pingin. It was as if a 3-foot-long sword were growing out of her abdomen, and its tip was aimed straight at Qian Pingin's Zhongting acupoint, which was situated right in the center of his midsection. Lu Feng grabbed onto the hilt of his sword in a subtle fashion, but then quickly released it again. In this dire situation, Qian Pingin abruptly vanished from the spot, using up his final inch movement talisman. The assassin removed one of his hands from the hilt of his sword, then pressed it against the back of Yur's head before pushing forward forcefully, sliding her body off his sword. Yur fell to the ground several dozen feet her way, and her body was heaving violently as blood gushed freely out of her mouth. The back of her clothes was already completely soaked with blood, and she attempted to turn her own body around, but she only managed to press the palm of her hand against the ground before she collapsed once again. The assassin was a barefoot young man with his sleeves rolled up, and he turned to Qian Pingin, who was catching his breath. A wide smile appeared on the young man's face as he said, I heard that there were immortal treasures to be gained from killing you, so I came. My name is Feng Qingbai and I'm a swordsman. I'm one of the upper 10 elites, so that's already one in the bag. And with the second one I'll be able to secure in exchange for your head. I'll be making a killing. It's a pity that I wasn't able to kill you with a single blow. In a direct battle I doubt that I'll be a match for you, but that's fine, I can work with Lu Feng to take you down. He's the only one worthy of the title of Sword Immortal here, and he'll definitely be going back. Ma Xian's godly body was broken. The woman with the lute remained embedded into the wall with loose rocks clattering onto the ground in front of her. Yur was laying in a puddle of her own blood, and her fair and delicate exposed feet presented a stark contrast with the dark red blood beneath her body. However, there was still Lu Feng, Feng Qingbai, Qian Tang, and Zhou Shi to be dealt with. The emaciated little girl was curled up into a ball on the little stool as she thought to herself, keep going. Smash their heads open so I can take their clothes and shoes. I can tell just by looking that they must be worth a lot. The little girl took a glance at Yur, and in particular, her gaze settled on her wooden clogs. In her mind, Yur deserved her fate for dressing in such an ostentatious fashion. Qian Pingin clenched his fists before loosening, repeating the process a few times. He had practiced his fist techniques for so long, and it was time to put them to work. On the summit of Bull Mountain, Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu was standing with a solemn and uncertain expression as he asked, Is that really true? Not only will killing that man grant an additional spot, there are 3 fated opportunities on offer as well? Why is that? Out of all of the nation's secret historical records and the secret files of the Reverence Pagoda, there have been no instances of this ever happening near the conclusion of any 60-year period. Could this be a trap set by Ding Ying? At this moment, Eugenie was carefully engraving a bamboo jade fan with a carving knife, and he was doing so with such painstaking care that he resembled a love-struck man caressing the skin of the woman of his heart. Instead of responding to Zhongqiu's question, he continued to stare intently at the fine engravings that he had made, and sweat was already beginning to bead up on his forehead, which was very abnormal, considering his exceptional martial arts cultivation base. As an elite master who was second only to Ding Ying, Environmental temperatures no longer had any impact on him. On top of that, it was said that he had obtained an immortal scripture some years ago, through which he was able to glean the will of the heavens for the past several decades and attain powerful mystical abilities. In fact, some even proclaimed in no uncertain terms that they had seen Eugenie taking flight across the heavens, and it was exactly during this time that his appearance had reverted back to a young boy from that of an old man. After a successful decade-long stint of seclusion, he had finally become one with the heavens, and everyone was hoping that Eugenie would face Ding in battle, as the leader of the righteous path. Ideally, he would strike Ding down and bring peace to the land. If he could do that, then the emperors would no longer have to worry about having their heads claimed by Ding during their sleep, nor would the masters of both the righteous and demonic paths have to continue to look up at the insurmountable old devil. Even the most powerful figures among the demonic forces were hoping that their enigmatic ancestor would either drop dead or complete the legendary act of ascension. In any case, they wanted him out of this world. It had already been 80 years, and it was about time that someone else claimed the top spot in his stead. Aside from Eugenie and Zhongqiu, there was also an extremely beautiful woman dressed in regal azure clothing on the summit of Bull Mountain. It was the most prestigious formal dress of Southern Garden Nation's empress, and it was only worn during imperial assemblies, temple fairs, and other prestigious events. The woman was none other than Empress Zhou Shuzhen of Southern Garden Nation. She also had another status that no one knew of. She was the pagoda master of the Reverence Pagoda, and she was responsible for ranking the top martial artists under the heavens once every 20 years. Zhou Fei had been lusting over her stunning beauty for a very long time, and just as Zhou Shi had proclaimed back in White River Temple, if it weren't for the fact that Zhongqiu was based right next to the imperial palace, Zhou Fei would have already stormed into the palace to abduct her. Eugenie set down the fan in his hand, then raised an arm to wipe the sweat from his forehead. As he did so, he gently exhaled, releasing a faint cloud of mist that lingered around his face, refusing to dissipate. After that, he replied to Zhongqiu, "It should be true. Having said that, it's very difficult to glean Ding Ying's intentions, even at the best of times. In contrast with hunting down that young swordsman, we should be much more wary of what Ding Ying could be plotting right now. I don't feel very comfortable with what's happening over on Champion Scholar Alley right now. I think it would be best if you went there to oversee the proceedings in person." Imperial Preceptor Zhong. The fact that Eugenie was referring to him as Imperial Preceptor Zhong indicated that their relationship was indeed rather strained. Zhongqiu's brow furrowed slightly as he said, "Not only is Ding Ying overseeing matters at Champion Scholar Alley, Lu Feng is also there with his sword. So what's there to be worried about?" "I don't trust Ding Ying or Lu Feng," Eugenie replied with a shake of his head. Zhongqiu was a little displeased upon hearing this. Lu Feng is an open and upstanding man. What could you possibly find distrustful about him? Are you having doubts solely because he's associated with that swordsman? This had always been the case for Eugenie. While it was true that he was open and candid in everything that he did, there was an air of cold detachment about him that only became more and more apparent the closer one got to him. "If you don't want to go, then I'll go," Eugenie said in an indifferent voice. Zhongqiu gave a cold harumph, and he didn't even take a glance at Empress Zhou before swooping down toward the foot of the mountain like an eagle. In the blink of an eye, he became a tiny speck in the distance, and before long he was completely out of sight. Even a martial artist as formidable as Zhongqiu still isn't able to fly like the immortals in the historic records. "Are you able to accomplish that feat, Eugenie?" Empress Zhou asked. Eugenie offered no response. Zhou Shuzhen smiled as she added, "Even if he's not flying, he still looks very graceful and elegant." Back when she had first met Zhongqiu and Eugenie in a foreign nation as a young woman, the former had shone as brightly as a star, while the latter was far more restrained, but she had been mesmerized by both of them. Eugenie rose to his feet, and the top of his head didn't even reach Zhou Shuzhen's chest. However, as soon as he stood up, Zhou Shuzhen felt as if she had been banished to the foot of the mountain, where she had to look up at him on the mountain summit. "Have the upper 10 elites been finalized?" Eugenie asked. Zhou Shuzhen nodded in response, then sighed. "It's a lot like the examinations held for officials in the imperial court, but it's not as brutal." Eugenie clasped his hands behind his back, looking out into the distance with an absent-minded expression. After a brief silence, Zhou Shuzhen asked, "Where is Tong Qingqing right now?" Eugenie was silent for a moment, then replied, I presume only Dingying knows the answer to that question. Zhou Shuzhen turned to him, then asked, just how lofty is Dingying's martial arts cultivation base? I don't know, Eugenie replied. The little boy was utterly terrified, so much so that he became numb to fear. He was the only person left in the world, lonely and without support. The little boy had only read a few elementary books for children, so he naturally didn't understand the concept of making a compromise. His face was filled with hatred as he gritted his teeth and asked, What's your name? There was an amused smile on the old man's face. I'll definitely kill you in the future. I'm going to exact revenge for my parents and my grandparents, the little boy added. The old man wearing a silver lotus flower hat pointed at himself and chuckled. What's my name? People in the world all like to refer to me as Old Demon Ding. This goes for both righteous cultivators and demonic cultivators. In fact, cultivators from demonic forces might even use the respectful title of paramount leader when they see me. As for my actual name, it's Dingying. However, it's already been many years since I've used this name. The old man then asked, So what's your name then? The little boy's voice was quivering, yet he still tried to speak as loudly as possible as he replied, Chao Qinglang. You're really taking advantage of things with that name, aren't you? Old Demon Ding said in amusement. 1. Add to that your physique, and you really need to be careful of being beaten up by others when you travel around the cultivation world in the future. Old Demon Ding casually flicked his sleeve, causing fierce winds to rush into the paper windows of the side room. There was a loud whooshing sound, yet the thin paper windows were surprisingly unharmed. It was as if something were pushed out of the side room. His entire family had been killed, so the name given to him by his parents became his last link to them. Old Demon Ding paid no heed to this, and he instead turned his gaze to the old hens pecking at the ground in the courtyard. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, scooping up some rice before returning to his seat in the side room. He then casually scattered the rice on the ground, causing the chickens to quickly flap their wings and rush over, delightedly pecking at the rice. People in the world all fear me. However, look at them. They don't fear me, Old Demon Ding said with a smile. He bent down and leaned slightly forward, asking, Does this mean that the so-called elites, grandmasters, generals and emperors are all inferior to measly chickens? Chao Qinglang was far too young, and his mind was also flooded with thoughts of revenge. That being the case, how could he possibly be willing to mull over such a question? He simply glared at the demonic cultivator, who had ruthlessly killed his family. He blamed himself for not being strong enough to do anything. A thought suddenly occurred to Chao Qinglang, and he recalled that there was still a hatchet in the kitchen. However, the hatchet hadn't been used or sharpened much. His house was in the capital, and his family could also be regarded as quite well off. They were wealthy enough to stop those people who hollered and sold charcoal from their cow-drawn carts. Thus, the hatchet in the kitchen was mostly just for show. Old Demon Ding looked up at the sky and answered his own question, saying, Of course not. It's simply a case of the ignorant being fearless. Sometimes, the rats in the fields will hurriedly protect the grains in their paws when a mighty eagle flies past overhead. There aren't many people in our world, but there aren't few of them either. They're not much better than mortal humans, but they can at least see that threatening shadow. For example, Eugenie from Pine Song Nation who transitioned to cultivation, the old chef in the prince's residence in your southern garden nation, and that old lecturer monk from the Vajra temple. Dingying stood up after saying this, shaking his two sleeves and lightly flicking his fingers, causing bursts of astral energy to condense into silk-like strings and fly toward the window of the side room. His movements were far too quick, and the wisps of dark green astral energy were like shimmering stars as they continued to accumulate near the window. It was as if a dazzling picture of the galaxy were materializing in the side room. There are also some outsiders in our world. Those who come harbor ill intentions, while those who harbor good intentions don't come. We refer to these people as otherworldly immortals. They come to our world as if they're playing a game, and they arrive and leave just as quickly as a passing comet. As for what happens to this world, and regarding how much trouble they've caused and how dire the situation becomes, these otherworldly immortals don't care about this at all. They couldn't care less about the joys, sorrows, reunions, and partings in this world. Dingying smiled and feigned turning the page of a book. He then lightly clapped his hands together as if closing the imaginary book, saying, "It's as if these people read a page of some trivial book during their spare time, an entirely insignificant matter. They don't care what's written on the page, whether that be crumbling etiquette, rivers of blood, or misery and death." There was a clan of etiquette with a 1,000-year history, and this was a clan that had a sagely residence that contained the pleasant fragrance of books. However, a freakish descendant appeared and completely soiled the reputation of this clan. There was a small and isolated nation that produced a wildly ambitious emperor. He had no understanding of military affairs, yet he insisted on recklessly deploying all of his troops to start war after war. Within 20 years, half of the young men in his nation had already perished. Being such a young child, Chao Qinglang naturally didn't understand any of these things. He was still consumed by hatred and thoughts of revenge, so he exclaimed, "Then what did you do?" The little boy from the small alley choked with sobs and said, "You only know how to kill my mom and dad and my grandparents." There was grief and indignation in his voice as he shouted, "Do you think you're a gallant hero or something? No, you're an irredeemably heinous demon." As if purposely mocking Chao Qinglang, Ding Ying also started to wail in grief. However, he quickly broke into loud laughter. Was he being childish or was he simply deranged? Chao Qinglang shook with anger. Ding Ying chuckled and replied, "Truth be told, what do the actions of those otherworldly immortals have to do with me? They have absolutely nothing to do with me. I simply use their actions as an excuse to kill people. To kill some fairly interesting people." The old man raised his arm and straightened his palm as if it were a saber. He then slashed down again and again as if he were making minced meat, saying, "One otherworldly immortal, two otherworldly immortals, 3, 4. I'll hack all of them to death. Apart from them, there are also those so-called upper 10 elites as well as the weaker lower 10 elites. If they're interesting, then I'll allow them to live. If they're an eyesore, however, then I'll kill them as well." Chao Qinglang continued to sob. Ding Ying glanced up at the sky. This time, things were slightly different than 60 years ago. It was because of this that he had chosen to stay here instead of personally going over to fight. He hadn't gone crazy after all, so he naturally wouldn't attempt to challenge 9 or even more top-notch elites all by himself. Someone had attempted this 60 years ago, aspiring to claim all of the martial fortune of the world for themselves. However, they had suffered a very brutal loss. If the young owner of that flying sword managed to survive and become an unexpected surprise in everyone's eyes, then Ding Ying would leave this place when the time was right and make it such that the surprising young man was no longer a surprise. Ding Ying was aware that this world was much like a cage to raise poisonous insects. There was a secret hidden deep inside the old man's heart, one that no one else knew about. In order to unravel the mystery of this world, there was only a single thing that he cared about. What would happen if he rendered useless the 60 years spent to raise the poisonous insects? Would that person appear before him? If they did, who would they be? There were 2 critical events that needed to take place before this. First, Zhou Shi needed to die on the streets. His death would cause Lu Feng and Zhou Fei to voluntarily become involved in the situation. Second, the owner of the flying sword also needed to die. Ding Ying glanced back at the window and smiled. He felt would be quite easy to pull off. An old man with an aquiline nose gave off a natural sense of authority as he walked along the bustling streets of Southern Garden Nation's capital. He was most likely someone from the northern regions. He was extremely tall, and this made him stand out from the crowd and attract many gazes from the local residents. There were several male and female bodyguards with calm expressions and strong footsteps walking beside the old man, and just a single sideways glance from them would cause the local residents to quickly retract their curious gazes. The old man continued to sigh with emotion as he walked through this city that was known as the most virtuous in the world. He was accustomed to the boundless expanses of land and the sparse populations outside the cities, as well as the feeling of vastness and loneliness. As a result, he was unable to accustom himself to the bustling crowds of the capital. Just when the old man was feeling in a slightly foul mood, a strong and capable-looking man briskly walked over from the distance and used the dialect of the grasslands to inform his respected master that he had found that person. That person was currently at a place called the Imperial Examination Bridge, which wasn't far away from here. The old man asked his disciple to lead the way. It wasn't long before they crossed a stone bridge with a lengthy history and arrived at a shop near the waterside. This was surprisingly a silk shop, and the old man told his disciple to wait for him outside. Business was very slow for the silk shop, and there wasn't a single customer at this moment. The old man walked inside by himself. What he saw was a head that was just tall enough to poke above the counter, which wasn't tall at all. This person's hair was thinning and disheveled. The shopkeeper smiled when he saw the old man and he exclaimed, "Oh, what a rare customer! I wouldn't be surprised to see anyone else, but I'm indeed surprised to see you. It's as if the sun is rising from the west. I truly don't understand things anymore. Even though Zhou Fei's son gave me a heads up beforehand, telling me that you would come, I was actually quite skeptical of his words. I thought Zhou Shi was trying to trick me into heading out to act as a shield for his father." The shopkeeper walked out from behind the counter and gestured for the old man with an aquiline nose to sit wherever he wanted. He didn't mince his words as he continued, "Grandmaster Cheng, please hurry up and take a seat. Otherwise, I'll have to keep craning my neck to look up at you when we speak. It's too much effort." The old man, who had traveled a long way to come here, wasn't offended by the shopkeeper's words. He sat down on a crudely made guest chair and said in a frank manner, "I wouldn't have taken the risk and come here if it weren't for the fact that I don't trust the list of upper 10 elites from the Reverence Pagoda. Both you and I are ranked outside the top 5, so it's very likely that something unexpected will happen. Right now we can confidently confirm the identities of 3 otherworldly immortals, Feng Qingbai, Old Demon Ding's granddisciple Yer, and Zhou Fei's son Zhou Shi. However, who knows if there are any old bastards or little weasels still hiding in the world." The shopkeeper nodded in complete agreement. Including Eugenie and Zhongqiu, it was said that the 4 grandmasters were holding a meeting on Bull Mountain. However, this was only a surface-level explanation for the rest of the world. The Reverence Pagoda had chosen to publish the updated list of upper 10 elites in the capital of Southern Garden Nation this time. And this was the critical decision that harbored many secrets and ulterior motives. The old man with an aquiline nose chuckled coldly and said, "I use the spear and you use the sword, and just like Zhongqiu, both of us practice external martial arts. We're different from that sly old fox Eugenie, in the sense that we'll definitely suffer some wounds if we engage in life and death battles, be they minor or severe wounds. The 3 of us definitely can't wait for another 60 years. I've fought my hardest for the sake of this current opportunity, so I naturally need a payoff to justify all of my lingering wounds." The old man lightly patted the armrest of his chair after saying this. The chair remained unharmed, yet a dense web of cracks immediately spread across the floor of the shop under the chair. Outside the silk shop, the in-house disciples of the shopkeeper felt as if they were facing a formidable enemy when they detected the aura flowing through the shop. Their breathing started to become heavy. The shopkeeper smiled and remarked, "The aptitude of your disciples is quite mediocre. If I remember right, I heard that you found an astonishingly talented wolf boy in the grasslands many years ago? After carefully teaching him for all these years, surely he's no weaker than the other young prodigies such as Yer and Zhou Shi. He's dead. It's not good for someone to have overly good aptitude." The old man with the surname Cheng replied in an apathetic voice. "Cheng Yuanshan," the shopkeeper exclaimed in anger. "Even a monster wouldn't hurt its own children. Do you still have any humanity or conscience?" The old man, who had traveled hundreds of kilometers to Southern Garden Nation, was none other than armed sage Cheng Yuanshan, the 8th-ranked cultivator of the upper 10 elites. Cheng Yuanshan had secretly left the cities and gone to the grasslands after he was ranked as an upper 10 elite by the Reverence Pagoda around 20 years ago. He had quickly become an esteemed guest of the ruler of the grasslands. Cheng Yuanshan shot a sideways glance at the short old man who was concealing his identity and hiding in Southern Garden Nation, and he retorted, "Lu Zong, you still have the face to criticize me? What's your title? What does knife sharpener mean? What do you most like to sharpen your knife with?" Knife sharpener Lu Zong chuckled in reply. "I've only just arrived, and Southern Garden Nation is a region that Zhongqiu has worked very hard to develop. Which side is Zhongqiu taking this time?" Cheng Yuanshan asked in puzzlement. "I initially thought he was on Eugenie's side. However, this isn't necessarily the case by the look of things now. And what does old Demon Ding plan to do?" "He's the one with the least reason to do anything right now. Yet he's insisted on coming to the capital of Southern Garden Nation for some reason. What's his goal? After arms sage Chang Yuanshan referred to shopkeeper Lu Zong as the knife sharpener, there was a brief moment where the aura of the short old man rose explosively. However, Lu Zong's aura quickly weakened again, causing him to become that ingratiating shopkeeper once more. Lu Zong pointed at Chang Yuanshan and teased, "Ha, you're someone who likes to overthink things." Chang Yuanshan was well aware of the fact that Lu Zong hadn't set aside his cultivation during these past few years. In fact, Lu Zong's cultivation had improved even further, going beyond what was already an impressive cultivation base. However, no piece of astonishing news had traveled out from Southern Garden Nation during all these years that Zhong Qiu had guarded the imperial palace. Having lost his whetstones, how had Lu Zong's martial arts cultivation advanced instead of going back? Meanwhile, Chang Yuanshan had secretly killed many powerful individuals in the grasslands during the past years. During this period of time, he had also snuck to the south several times and killed 2 grandmasters from the cultivation world who had possessed the potential to become upper 10 elites. Chang Yuanshan's purpose for doing this was to temper his mental state through intense and deadly battles. He didn't dare to relax a single bit. Zhou Fei never fears anything when he speaks and acts. He's very much like those otherworldly immortals from the past, Chang Yuanshan said. He appears to be siding with Dinging this time, so why don't you give me a hint regarding whether this is good or bad? Other people aren't trustworthy when it comes to these matters, but you're an exception, Lu Zong. What's your reason for believing me? Lu Zong asked with a smile. A glut of people in the cultivation world are referred to as martial arts addicts, but in my mind you, Lu Zong, are the only person who's a genuine martial arts addict, Chang Yuanshan replied with a serious expression. You're the same as Dingying, Zhong Qiu, and Yu Zhani, and you're one of the few people who came out alive from that chaotic battle all those years ago. Of the upper 10 elites at that time, some died and some vanished, and it was surprisingly fringe members like the 3 of you who each managed to obtain their own fated opportunities. Dingying obtained the Taoist hat left behind by that immortal, Yu Zhani obtained a secret immortal scripture, and I'm not exactly sure what Zhong Qiu obtained. Lu Zong stroked his thinning beard and smiled with squinted eyes, asking, "You're an outsider who wasn't personally involved in that disaster, so how do you know of these secret matters?" This matter was an itch that Lu Zong had always wanted to scratch. He couldn't discuss this with ordinary people, but now that arms sage Chang Yuanshan had explicitly mentioned it, knife sharpener Lu Zong couldn't help but feel a little smug. I was the one who killed the new owner chosen by that demonic saber refiner. However, I wasn't able to obtain the saber for myself, Chang Yuanshan replied honestly. Arms sage Chang Yuanshan had always been a proud and haughty person, so he most likely looked down on some of the other cultivators on the list of upper 10 elites, for example, the Mirror Heart Pavilion's Tong Qingqing. As for the lower 10 elites, a list of yet another 10 cultivators compiled by people with nothing better to do, Chang Yuanshan had once announced that some of these people could make tea for him, some could take his shoes off for him, and some could help guard and maintain his courtyard for him. Even though they were all top-notch elites renowned throughout the world, not a single member of the lower 10 elites was worthy in Chang Yuanshan's eyes. However, Chang Yuanshan was extremely polite when visiting Lu Zong today. In fact, he was even willing to subtly treat himself as slightly inferior to Lu Zong. Judging from this, it was abundantly clear that Chang Yuanshan had zero confidence in his current trip to the capital of Southern Garden Nation. Lu Zong extended a finger and stuck it into his mouth, scraping out some remnant shards of meat stuck between his teeth from his previous meal. He casually flicked the meat aside and explained, "A butcher's skill is determined by how long he can use his favorite knife for peeling skin, chopping meat, and scraping meat from bones. The worst butchers need to swap their knives every 2 to 3 years, while slightly better butchers will swap theirs every 7 to 8 years. As for my knife, I've used it from my first day in the cultivation world all the way until now. It's already been close to 40 years. He chuckled. Only killing those disguised otherworldly immortals is satisfying enough. I've sharpened my knife for dozens of years, so I dearly hope that my skills don't become like those bullshit dragon-slaying techniques from the books. When I welcome the otherworldly immortals to this world, I welcome them with open arms." An impoverished scholar who had traveled to the capital to attend the imperial examination was currently waiting for his beautiful partner to return. In fact, He had even gone against the sagely teachings of noble people needing to stay out of the kitchen for the sake of his partner. They had come across each other by chance in the cultivation world, and she was very fond of making jokes with him even though she was 6 years older. She always claimed that she was a bad woman. However, the scholar felt didn't matter. After all, she could play such beautiful tunes with the pipa, tunes that perfectly captured the passion and intensity of the battlefield, as well as the hidden resentment lingering inside a woman's room. That being the case, she definitely couldn't be too bad. A person mysteriously walked over and told the scholar a story about some woman from the cultivation world. If this story were true, the scholar felt like the woman in the story was irredeemably evil. However, the scholar felt like his partner was different. He felt like she was a very good woman. She was knowledgeable and sensible, and gentle and virtuous. Not only that, but she was also very beautiful. The scholar felt like she was someone worth marrying and growing old together with. He was waiting for her to return home. He wanted to tell her these heartfelt thoughts when he saw her again. The Vajra Temple was the #1 temple in the capital of Southern Garden Nation. At the same time, it was also the largest temple in this world and a Buddhist holy land with the most monks. There was a secluded and remote thatched cottage in the temple, and the doors of this crude cottage were wide open. The cottage was very empty, and there was surprisingly nothing else apart from an old monk and a straw mat. A slim and handsome young master was surrounded by a dozen or so breathtaking beauties as he slowly walked toward this unremarkable thatched cottage. They ranged from 13 to 40 years old, and they were all extremely beautiful. If someone from the Reverence Pagoda were present, they would discover that there were extremely renowned celestial maidens, noble women from powerful clans, and so on. Without exception, these women were all renowned for their beauty. There were many Buddhist scripture banners hanging outside the thatched cottage. The young man was like a prince traveling with his beautiful concubines, and he explained the concepts and origins of Buddhist terms such as the 10 directions, Aranya, Ksana, and Dvaja to them as they walked toward the thatched cottage. 3. The ladies were mostly from good family backgrounds, so quite a few of them possessed extremely impressive knowledge. Thus, some of them gave silvery laughs and pointed out a few mistakes that the young man had made. However, the young man didn't explain anything, and he simply said that different places had different customs and explanations. Moreover, he claimed that the explanations from his hometown conformed better with the fundamental teachings of Buddhism. The meditating old monk opened his eyes and asked with a smile, "Benefactor Zhou, you've already received Ding Ying's promise and guaranteed yourself a position among the upper 10 elites, so why did you still come here?" The young man with the surname Zhou raised his hand and gestured for the group of a dozen or so ladies not to follow him. He walked toward the thatched cottage by himself and replied with a chuckle, "I'm here to request a golden arhat body for my worthless son." When he neared the door, he raised his foot and respectfully asked, "Should I take my boots off? I'm afraid of soiling your pure monastery." The old monk smiled and replied, "The soil on your boots is undefiled." In Benefactor Zhou's mind, does it make a difference whether you remove your boots or not? Baldies like you always like to spout such kinds of nonsense no matter where you are, the young man said in exasperation. You give your nonsense the glorified name of Buddhist allegories, and I genuinely can't bring myself to. Or, the young man then pointed at the empty cottage and posited, "This place looks empty, but aren't you still here?" The old monk sighed and replied, "Benefactor Zhou, you're someone who possesses the root of wisdom and understands all of the relevant principles, but it's a shame that you're not willing to turn back." The young man with the surname Zhou still decided to take his boots off before entering the thatched cottage. He sat down next to the door and raised an arm, pointing at the group of beautiful ladies behind him, all of them shapely and attractive in different ways. "How would you persuade me if they're the Buddhist principles that I seek?" he asked the old monk. "Trying to have subtle and mystical debates with otherworldly immortals like you is truly very tiring," the old monk replied with a pained expression. The young man theatrically lowered his head and put his palms together, saying "Umitba" while smiling with squinted eyes. The old monk's face was already wizened to begin with, yet it appeared even more wrinkled and anxious at this moment. Ordinary people were unable to enter the Vajra temple. Perhaps officials and nobility from Southern Garden Nation were able to enter, but even they were unable to find this simple thatched cottage. However, the young man who looked to be around 20 years old was different. This was because his name was Zhou Fei. He was the fourth-rank superior grandmaster in the world, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to describe his profound martial arts skills as having reached the pinnacle. Moreover, he was masterful in musical instruments, go, calligraphy, and painting. The ladies outside, both young and mature, genuinely liked Zhou Fei. Perhaps they had been forced into a relationship with him in the beginning. Some had feelings for other men, some were already married, some were loyal women already teaching their children, and they had all been forcefully dragged into the mountains by Zhou Fei or his subordinates in the Springtide Palace. However, after interacting with Zhou Fei every day, perhaps for a mere few months or for a lengthy 5 to 10 years, there was ultimately not a single lady who could avoid falling in love with him. This was a strange happening in the cultivation world that didn't appear to make any sense at all. Those in the lower levels of the cultivation world always liked to describe Zhou Fei, the so-called emperor of the mountains and the founder of the Springtide Palace, as a morbidly obese and incredibly ugly person. Or perhaps they would describe him as a cruel and violent man who killed people on a whim. However, none of this was true. Disregarding revenge killings in the cultivation world and only focusing on the ladies who were attracted to him, Zhou Fei was not only talented and elegant, but he was also able to maintain his youthful appearance after all this time. Zhou Fei smiled and asked, "To have a father and his son ascend from this world together. Isn't this very worth looking forward to?" The old monk sighed and replied, "I was indeed hiding the White River Temple's golden arhat body before. However, Benefactor Ding reappeared in the capital after disappearing for 60 years, and he immediately transported the golden arhat body to the imperial palace of Southern Garden Nation. You've come too late, Benefactor Zhou." Zhou Fei stared into the old monk's eyes for a moment before changing the topic and asking, "I've heard that there exists an azure garment that drifts around the capital and is invisible to the naked eyes of mere mortals. Are you able to see this garment, old monk?" Before the old monk could even reply, Zhou Fei narrowed his eyes and said in a firm voice, "I hope you're able to see it." However, he was radiating with killing intent. The old monk remained silent, seemingly practicing silent meditation. Or perhaps he was weighing up the pros and cons of his responses. Zhou Fei was someone who would stick to his promises. If he said that he would massacre the Vajra temple, then he would definitely kill everyone in the temple, even the child monks and the sweeping monks. Zhou Fei gave a hearty laugh and retracted his concentrated killing intent that was almost tangible, saying, "For treasures in total have appeared in this world during the past 60 years, the golden arhat body and the sky-soaring garment in Southern Garden Nation, the suit of treasured armor in Pine Song Nation, and the demonic saber that can shatter all immortal techniques in the lands beyond the cities. If a member of the upper 10 elites manages to obtain one of these treasures, then their standing in the world will naturally become even more stable. Meanwhile, elites who are almost as powerful as the upper 10 elites will become even more impressive if they manage to obtain one of the 4 treasures. In fact, they'll have a chance to squeeze some poor sucker out of the top 10 ranks." As if making his mind up about something, the old monk set aside all worries and appeared far more relaxed than before. Seemingly making small talk with Zhou Fei, he asked, "Benefactor Zhou, is Buddhism flourishing in your hometown?" Zhou Fei pursed his lips and replied, "Over there? It's hard to say. There exist some texts that have fragmented records about otherworldly immortals like you. It's said that those who have attained Tao can vaporize large lakes with a sweep of their arm, shatter mountains with their punch, transform their breath into a flying sword that can behead people 500 kilometers away, ride on the wind to cross rivers and seas, and capture flood dragons with a single hand. Is this true?" the old monk asked. Zhou Fei was just about to reply. However, a woman in white suddenly flew over at this moment, directly landing outside the simple thatched cottage and saying with a panicked expression, "Young master was severely injured near Champion Scholar Alley." "What?" Zhou Fei asked with a displeased expression. The beautiful and aloof woman hesitated as if she wanted to say something. However, she eventually fell to her knees with a thud, with her entire body trembling. The corners of Zhou Fei's lips twitched as he slowly raised his palm to his forehead. Lu Feng, not only are you stupid but you're also useless. You couldn't even protect my son." The fingers on his pale and jade-like hand were like hooks, and it was as if he were trying to crack open his own skull. Zhou Fei put his hand down and lightly patted his knee before suddenly flicking his sleeves backward. The stunningly beautiful woman kneeling outside the thatched cottage flew back like a rag doll, exploding into pieces before she could even land. The group of ladies standing further away all moved to the side, yet many of them were still drenched in blood. Even so, not a single one of them dared to express resentment or anger. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Zhou Fei exhaled heavily before smiling and continuing. Old monk, let's continue our conversation from before. I'll deal with these family matters after we finish our chat. The old monk was rendered speechless. Zhou Fei didn't push the old monk to speak and he asked, "How was my son injured?" However, he suddenly realized that the woman was already dead. So he extended a hand outside his sleeve and rapidly formed a seal, performing a mystical technique that wasn't recorded in any of the Buddhist and Taoist texts in this world. The faintly discernible figure of a woman vaguely materialized outside the thatched cottage. She was still trembling in terror after death, and she timidly hovered toward Zhou Fei, moving her lips but making no sound. However, it was clear that Zhou Fei alone could hear what she was saying. The old monk sighed upon seeing this. No matter how strong one was, there was always someone stronger. Zhou Fei pinched two fingers together, and the woman's soul condensed into a snow-white pearl between his fingers. He gently placed the pearl inside his sleeve before looking up at the old monk from the Vajra temple. Zhou Fei's tone was no longer as casual as before as he directly said, "Let's talk about that azure garment again. I know it's related to you." And Zhou Fei especially came to the temple for this garment before. However, the old monk was still unwilling to talk about this matter, and his eyes were filled with nostalgia as he gazed at the lush green forest outside his thatched cottage. "I have a junior brother, and we studied Buddhism together when we were young." He said that he was unable to accept the existence of sad stories. When he came across sad stories, he would inevitably think that Buddhas existed in the world, so how was the mortal world still filled with so many sad stories? What could he change even if he became a Buddha? "I left the small temple in my hometown afterward, so I don't know if my junior brother has become a Buddha yet." Zhou Fei suppressed the anger in his mind before lightly shaking his head and sneering. "How can someone from such a small place become a genuine Buddha? You're overthinking things, old monk." The old monk shook his head and replied, "I simply want to know whether my junior brother is still alive. After all these years, I truly crave a bowl of rice porridge made by my junior brother." Zhou Fei was just about to stand up and he said, "I don't have time to speak in circles with you anymore. I'll send you on your way now, and you can ask your junior brother whether he can still make rice porridge in the afterlife." The old monk smiled faintly and asked with a calm expression, "Zhou Fei, can you fulfill one request from me if I help you obtain that golden arhat body from the imperial palace?" Zhou Fei sat down again and asked in amusement, "A request from you?" The old monk raised a hand and ran it over his bald head, saying with emotion, "I don't plan to be a monk anymore. I was abandoned at the entrance of a temple when I was little, and I was picked and raised by my good-hearted master. I always daydreamed with my junior brother back then, and the thing that I wanted the most was actually a comb." The old monk removed his external Buddhist robe and folded it neatly, placing it aside as he said in a quiet voice, "Please help her find a way to escape from this place. She doesn't deserve to be trapped in this small place anymore." An azure dress with large sleeves appeared in one corner of the thatched cottage. The beautiful ladies outside the thatched cottage had served Zhou Fei for many years, so they had naturally witnessed many things and were thus very knowledgeable. Even so, they were still amazed when they saw the azure dress hovering in midair. The azure dress hovered to the old monk's side, with the hem of the dress slowly descending to the ground. In the end, one could vaguely discern that the dress was in a kneeling position. The old monk was no longer as proper with his words after taking off his Buddhist robe, and he said, "I've already acted as the light-bearing monk and lecturing monk of the Vajra temple for so many years. One day after day and year after year, I've spoken tens of thousands of lines of Buddhist scriptures and teachings to them. My audience consisted of all kinds of people, those from the 3 teachings and also those from the 9 schools of philosophy. However, they merely listened to my teachings without actually implementing anything. They still go to war with each other, and they still engage in revenge killings in the cultivation world. What can I do? As a monk, can I grab a saber to eliminate those violent people and restore peace? Can I prevent violence through violence? Should I rest my saber on their shoulders and force them to pledge themselves to kindness and Buddhism? The azure dress raised a sleeve and held it above its collar, seemingly covering its mouth and laughing softly. The old monk fixed his gaze on Zhou Fei and asked, "Can you fulfill my request?" Zhou Fei was in no hurry to give an answer. The old monk from the Vajra temple was the Buddhist sage of this world. He was skilled at writing large characters, and each of his characters would be like a golden Vajra brimming with boundless energy. 3. After a while, Zhou Fei sighed and replied, "One should show some sincerity when doing business with others. Old monk, are you truly unaware that one can leave this place after obtaining this kind of recognized fated opportunity?" The old monk turned around to glance at the azure dress before replying in helplessness, "She's not the same." Zhou Fei was an otherworldly immortal who had regained his memories extremely quickly, yet he still didn't dare to claim that he understood all of the rules in this world. After all, his soul had been restricted by some genuine immortal secret technique before he had come here. The Mirror Heart Hall, the Vajra Temple, and the Reverence Pagoda. After experiencing calamity after calamity, the leaders of these three forces had definitely accumulated much experience. Thus it was entirely possible that they knew just as much as Zhou Fei. The old monk smiled and continued, "However, my mind is completely at ease after hearing Benefactor Zhou ask this question. Speaking from my perspective, being able to leave with Zhou Shi is naturally the best outcome," Zhou Fei said directly. "However, in the off chance that some accident occurs, for example, the type right now where Zhou Shi has been severely injured by someone and therefore lost the opportunity to secretly become an upper 10 elite, then I need to guarantee that after my departure, Zhou Shi can have a greater chance of success after the next 60 years. Zhou Shi, your Fan Wanner and the others, regardless of who it is, and as long as someone is willing to take care of them, they'll definitely soar and shine once they leave this place and enter a larger world." Zhou Fei was unable to hide his fury anymore after saying this, and he spat. "Lu Feng, that utter fool. He's clearly seen through this world, yet he hasn't managed to genuinely see through it. Where the hell can I find him, his master's wife and junior sister or whatnot? And he even had the gall to stab me with his sword back then." The old monk looked up at the man in front of him. Zhou Fei suddenly raised a hand, after which a letter materialized between his fingers. Looking down and skimming through the contents, Zhou Fei roared with hearty laughter and exclaimed, "The heavens are on my side." He turned around and glanced at the group of beautiful ladies standing outside the thatched cottage, and he couldn't help but sigh with emotion in his mind. He was filled with regret. To say nothing of his fellow otherworldly cultivator, Tong Qingqing, even Empress Zhou Shuzhen from Southern Garden Nation, Fan Wanner from the Mirror Heart Hall, and Yura from the demonic force were far more talented and knowledgeable than this group of beautiful ladies. Dressed in casual clothes, Prince Wei Yan of Southern Garden Nation led two people through the corridors of residence. One of them was his respected teacher, an old man short and skinny like a monkey. However, this old man was an undisputed martial arts grandmaster in the world. Meanwhile, the other person was Fan Wanner, someone who was regarded as a goddess by those in the cultivation world of Southern Garden Nation. She was a celestial maiden from the Mirror Heart Hall, a holy land of the martial arts world. There was a strange expression on Wei Yan's face at this moment, slightly awkward but mostly relieved and thankful. However, he stopped himself from revealing too much because his master was also present. The old man who had taught Wei Yan his impressive martial arts skills huffed and said, "What a sly person. I actually failed to see through him even though he hid under my nose for so many years. When we meet again, I need to spar with him to see just how powerful the upper 10 elites of this world truly are." Imperial Preceptor Zhong is a rare person of exceptional ability, so I've always been convinced by his knowledge and power. However, I refuse to believe that a measly cook can be so powerful as well. The old man continued to grumble and curse. As it turned out, the updated list of upper 10 elites compiled by the Reverence Pagoda had briefly described the names, residences, and martial arts cultivation bases of each person on the list. Those like Ding Ying Yuzhini and the others were all old faces. However, one person had suddenly come out of nowhere, and his hiding place was none other than the residence of Southern Garden Nation's Prince Wei Yan. He had surprisingly disguised himself as a cook. A tall old man whose body smelled of smoke, oil, and salt was taking a break and squatting outside the spotless and smoothly running kitchen. He was holding a handful of golden yellow fried soybeans and tossing them into his mouth one after another. Inside the kitchen, his disciples and grand-disciples were busily preparing lunch for today. The old cook heaved a forlorn sigh when he saw Prince Wei Yan, scrunching his old face and knowing that he couldn't enjoy peace and quiet anymore. Wei Yan ordered all of the cooks, assistants, and maidservants to leave the area, and the old cook didn't try to stop him from doing so. Instead, he continued to sigh as he remained squatting there, seemingly resigned to his fate. As for the short old man who had been fuming just then, he immediately backed down and abandoned his plan to criticize the old cook on the list of upper 10 elites after genuinely seeing him in person. He became silent and taciturn as he kept his eyes fixed on the old cook, who had been hiding inside the imperial palace this entire time. Meanwhile, the old cook kept glancing at Fan Wanner out of the corners of his eyes. He would steal a rapid glance at her before immediately retracting his gaze. However, as if he couldn't suppress his urge, he would quickly steal a glance at her again. Even Fan Wanner was slightly puzzled by this. Wei Yan couldn't help but mumble in his mind. Perhaps this old cook was an old pervert as well? When looking at the upper 10 elites of the previous generations, none of these people cared about mortal beauty anymore. This was with the exception of the Springtide Palace's Zhou Fei and the Mirror Heart Hall's Tong Qingqing. The old cook's first question was extremely intimidating, and he asked, "Do you know how many kinds of otherworldly immortals there are?" Wei Yan and the monkey-like old man exchanged a glance. However, Fan Wanner knew a little about this because she had come from the Mirror Heart Hall. The old cook popped a fried soybean into his mouth and remarked, "Only the delicacies of the world haven't failed me yet. If this is forcefully taken from me as well, then I'll have no option but to become a drunkard." The old cook didn't look at Fan Wanner anymore, and he poured the rest of the fried soybeans into his mouth before patting his hands clean and standing up, saying, "When otherworldly immortals descend to the mortal world to train, one type is like Zhou Fei and Feng Qingbai, people who become aware of their identity very early on and understand what they're seeking in the mortal world. Thus, their actions appear shocking to us, yet it appears completely natural to them. However, these types of otherworldly immortals won't covet items that are too profound. As for Tong Qingqing, the founder of the Mirror Heart Hall that you belong to, she's seemingly hiding from something or someone. The second type of otherworldly immortals is people like Lu Feng. He became aware of his identity relatively late, yet it was guaranteed that he would definitely regain his memories at some certain point in time. The third type of otherworldly immortals, and this is only a speculation of mine, are people who continue to follow the wishes of their new identities. As a result, they never become aware of their true identities, and they never regain their memories. Instead, they remain ignorant and muddle-headed, as they experience reincarnation after reincarnation. After a long time, their hometown becomes a forgotten memory, while this foreign land becomes their new hometown. This type of otherworldly immortal is relatively unique in the sense that they'll often possess powerful physiques and enjoy very impressive martial arts talent. In the eyes of others, however, they'll always be that slight bit weaker than those standing at the pinnacle of the world. The old cook looked at Fan Wanner again and continued, "However, it's inevitable that this type of otherworldly immortal will experience seemingly unreasonable things. People in the mortal world sometimes talk about others becoming spellbound or possessed by a ghost, and a small number of these cases are actually related to this type of otherworldly immortal. Little girl, have you felt anything strange recently?" Fan Wanner hesitated for a moment before nodding and replying, "Twice." The old cook nodded and said with a wide smile, "Old Demon Ding sure is impressive. Anyone in the world can be killed, and anyone in the world can be forgiven. He's already no inferior to that maniac from the past. In fact, he's even smarter. If you ask me, I say that he'll most likely succeed this time. Eugenie wants to protect this world, so I naturally find him very impressive as well. However, some certain people will most likely think that his vision is too narrow. On the other hand, Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu, who has always been slightly weaker than Eugenie, traveled across the mountains and rivers of the Four Nations and the barbaric lands by himself a few years ago. I feel like he'll achieve more success in the future." The old cook sighed and continued, "As for me, the more I say and the more I do, the more mistakes I'll make. That being the case, I might as well not ask, not listen, and simply wait for death. I still wanted to fight and do something in the past, but the longer that passes and the more that I see, the less motivation I feel to do anything. Old Demon Ding and Eugenie are mortal enemies during this chaotic time. And no one on the list of upper 10 elites will be able to flee from them this time. In any case, I'm no longer curious about the true identity of otherworldly immortals. I simply want to live for 20 to 30 more years. That will be enough to satisfy me. So, the old cook suddenly held 2 fingers together and formed a sword seal, stabbing several of his critical acupoints and instantly causing his body to become drenched in blood. His aura had initially been close to integrating with Tao in the eyes of Eugenie and the otherworldly immortal, Qian Pinyin. But this powerful aura was instantly shattered at this moment. Once a top-notch grandmaster of this world, the old cook's cultivation base plummeted all the way until he was even weaker than the monkey-like old man. He chose to voluntarily withdraw from this turbulent and chaotic struggle. The old cook's face was deathly pale, yet his smile was relieved as turned to Prince Wei Yan and asked, "This residence is so big, so it should be able to feed an old geezer like me for another 20 to 30 years, right? Of course, your highness can ask for my help, if you genuinely need my strength for something." Wei Yan nodded and replied, "Feel free to stay here and recuperate. I definitely won't disturb your cultivation for no reason." On the peak of Bull Mountain, Zhou Shuzhen, who had just walked to the foot of the mountain before climbing to the top again, smiled wryly as she handed a secret letter to Eugenie. Eugenie accepted the letter and read through its contents before furrowing his brows and asking, "What's going on? This is definitely from the Reverence Pagoda, but it definitely wasn't planned by the Reverence Pagoda," Zhou Shuzhen replied in a helpless voice. Eugenie glanced up at the sky. When one was standing high up enough as they gazed down at the mortal world, it would seem as if one were gazing upon a majestic sea of stars. However, it was very difficult to focus on a single person. Eugenie was well aware of this fact. He had experienced it many times before. For example, the 3 specks of light that represented Old Demon Ding, Qian Pinyin, and Lu Feng, all who were currently located near Champion Scholar Alley, were especially blinding. Further in the distance, there were 2 extremely bright specks of light near the Vajra Temple, and 4 extremely bright specks of light near Prince Wei Yan's residence. However, the brightest of the latter 4 specks of light suddenly became dim. This type of distant observation didn't use much of Eugenie's spiritual energy, which he had already accumulated for many years. However, he would need to pay a significant price if he wanted to carefully observe any specific person. In some residence near Champion Scholar Alley, Old Demon Ding, who was wearing a lotus flower hat, suddenly received a secret letter from the Reverence Pagoda. His eyes lit up when he read to the end. There was such a good opportunity. Even Ding Ying was slightly attracted by this opportunity. He shot a glance at Chao Qinglang before clicking his tongue in wonder and exclaiming, "Little child, you're truly a fortunate person." As for that otherworldly immortal, he had definitely been ruthlessly screwed over by someone. Otherwise, he definitely wouldn't have attracted such severe backlash and suppression. From the history that Ding Ying knew, there had almost never been such blatant interference during the previous conflicts that took place every 60 years. No otherworldly immortal had ever been targeted before. Regardless of their initial aims and ulterior motives, 3 groups of people were targeting and hunting Qian Pinyin. Of the 7 extremely renowned elites from the cultivation world, 3 had already been defeated on this street: Pink Vajra Ma Xian, the woman who played Pipa, and Yura from the demonic force. Feng Qingbai was a madman who was traveling around the world as an adventurer, and he had been willing to do everything to achieve his aim. However, he had failed to kill Qian Pinyin with his surprise attack, during which he had smashed the wall and ruthlessly thrust his sword forward, and he had instead brought Yura to the brink of death. The girl in wooden clogs, who had the potential to inherit the position of leader of the demonic force, as a female, was still unable to turn her body at this moment. Her cheek rested against the ice-cold surface of the alleyway, and her slender and jade-like fingers lightly dragged across the blue stone slabs. Her eyes were filled with agony and pleading as she looked at Zhou Shi, the young man wearing a flower hairpin. Even though she had been joking when asking Zhou Shi to promise to keep her alive just then, he had ultimately agreed to her request, hadn't he? That being the case, why was he still unwilling to help her? However, Zhou Shi didn't feel a shred of guilt, and he even smiled faintly and nodded in acknowledgement as he caught Yura's gaze. Lu Feng didn't make a move the entire time. Meanwhile, the elusive smiley face had already exchanged a few attacks with Qian Ping'an. However, he hadn't managed to gain any advantage. Zhou Shi gently turned the sanguine prayer beads in his hand and said, "Of the people still standing, I'm the weakest of the group. However, I promise that I'll unleash my full strength to deal with this person in a moment." Mr. Lu, smiley face, Feng Qingbai. Can we temporarily set aside our differences to face the enemy together? There was a freaky smile on Smiley Face's face as he nodded and replied, "Regardless of who kills this person in the end, I only want a single thing from him, that immortal technique that shortens the land and transforms a long distance into an inch. If I can't obtain it, however, then my compensation needs to be rediscussed." Zhou Shi glanced at Yer, who was on the brink of death, before smiling and saying, "I only want her." Lu Feng gave the final word, saying, "Then it's settled." Feng Qingbai held his sword horizontally in front of himself before bending the fingers on his other hand and gently flicking the blade. There was an amused smile on his face as he said, "Sword Immortal Lu, you're not going to stand there and do nothing again, are you? Be careful of going for wool and coming back shorn. We don't want to end up as whetstones for this person to sharpen his martial arts cultivation on. You're the eldest and most powerful elite on our side, so I would rather pull out and abandon this opportunity if you still insist on hiding your strength and gambling with our lives in order to probe the strength of this person. If push comes to shove, I'll simply leave and let you people do whatever you want. Please rest assured," Lu Feng said with a smile. After saying this, the sword immortal from Bird's Eye View Peak, who had his palm on the hilt of his sword, clenched his hand into a fist and dragged Dachuan out from the ground, both sword and scabbard. Immortals from the past had once written about a tree called Dachuan. When this type of tree experienced spring for 8,000 years and then autumn for a further 8,000 years, and upon eating its fruit, mortal people could ride on iridescent clouds and ascend from the world. While Zhou Shi and the others discussed things, Qian Ping'an silently prepared himself and got ready to fight. In any case, he still needed to familiarize himself with his current state where he wasn't restricted by his Dao robe, golden sweet wine, anymore. Of the three fist techniques that Cui Chan's grandfather had taught him, the rain evaporation technique and the heavy cavalry formation shattering technique were relatively straightforward in the sense that he simply needed to control the strength of his punches. However, the deity drumming technique was completely different, and having his punch be just an inch off would cause the might of his attack to decrease drastically. Moreover, Qian Ping'an needed to be on guard against Lu Feng, so it was necessary for him to carefully control the power and accuracy of each punch. Ever since beginning to learn martial arts, this was the peak state of Qian Ping'an's fist techniques. At the same time, he was also experiencing the peak state of his physique, soul, and energy. He's making a move now. Be careful, everyone. Lu Feng smiled faintly and said in warning, "Seriously, you're not going to give a heads up before launching an attack? Where's your demeanor and pride as a grandmaster?" While saying this, Lu Feng flicked his wrist and held the hilt of his sword properly for the first time. After grabbing his renowned sword, Dachuan, Lu Feng's sword qi was so abundant that some of it suffused into the surroundings even though he was actively trying to suppress it. This caused his clothes to flutter even though there was no wind, and this was especially the case with the sleeve on his sword-wielding hand, which expanded and billowed as it filled with intense sword qi. Sounds of ringing swords surprisingly traveled out from the sleeve. Smiley Face instantly tensed up, and he immediately activated a secret technique from the damaged immortal text he had obtained by chance without any hesitation. Using an extremely mystical divination and formation technique, he immediately teleported from the east to the north. However, a fist aura was already rushing toward Smiley Face before he could even ascertain Qian Ping'an's position. The fist aura blasted toward his face, causing piercing pain to spread across his cheeks. It was at this moment that a burst of sword light suddenly appeared between Smiley Face and the powerful fist aura. To Smiley Face, the peerlessly sharp blade resting horizontally in front of him appeared much like a snow-white strand of silk. Qian Ping'an's fist was blocked by the blade, and this won a brief moment of respite for Smiley Face. His figure vanished several times as he retreated again and again, and it took him much effort to finally break free from the suffocating pressure radiating from the powerful fist aura. Smiley Face had been active in the cultivation world for more than 30 years after beginning cultivation, and his favorite opponent had initially been external martial arts grandmasters whom he could handle with ease. In fact, toying around with those so-called grandmasters who hopped around and seemed relatively sluggish was much like playing around with a dog. This was also why Smiley Face had earned the nickname Pesky Ghost. Several old grandmasters renowned for their martial arts skills had been brutally exhausted to death by Smiley Face, who was as pesky and elusive as a ghost. This was the first time Smiley Face had come across a martial artist skilled in fist techniques, who was even more elusive than him. Smiley Face knew that Feng Qingbai might be able to save him once or twice, but he wouldn't necessarily be able to save him for a third time. With this in mind, he didn't hold back anymore, hiding his hands in his large sleeves as he retreated and dodged. Several hiltless throwing knives appeared between Smiley Face's fingers, small and exquisite yet gleaming with deadly light. The blades of the knives were painted with dark green poison, the juice of heartbreak grass, and this was a poison most suitable for shattering a martial artist's aura. When Smiley Face retreated 15 to 20 meters away from Chan Ping'an, he saw that Feng Qingbai had also paid a price for launching an attack and helping him break free. Feng Qingbai was now being targeted by the enemy, and he quickly fell to a disadvantage after just 2 or 3 exchanges. His shoulder was struck by a sweeping kick, causing a loud crack to ring through the air as he was sent flying backward. A blur of white stalked him like a shadow, and it was clear that Feng Qingbai, whose shoulder was dangling limply by his side, was in extremely dire straits. It was Smiley Face's turn to repay the favor. Numerous throwing knives shot out from his sleeves. However, their opponent was a genuine freak, with each of his punches and steps appearing extremely calm and casual. Compared to Pink Vajrama Xian's powerful stomps which would crack the paved streets after summoning a deity, Chan Ping'an's footsteps were so nimble that Smiley Face was almost convinced that his boots weren't touching the ground at all. It was as if Chan Ping'an were walking on air. Smiley Face wasn't holding on to the wild hope that his 6 poison-throwing knives would hit his opponent, and he was instead hoping that his attack could buy some time for Feng Qingbai. Feng Qingbai cracked a grin and loosened his grip, surprisingly letting go of his sword. A sword practitioner abandoning his sword? Smiley Face couldn't help but feel anxious when he saw this. Perhaps the adventuring Feng Qingbai who had traveled from the north to the south in 10 years and defeated almost half of the martial arts world with his sword was already out of tricks? Perhaps this was the limit of his measly power? Feng Qingbai's sword didn't clatter to the ground. Instead, the sword blade shuddered slightly even though it wasn't being wielded by its owner. Ripples traveled through the air, and the sword suddenly became tense as it came to a rest in midair. The tip of the blade pointed upward, directly aiming at the young boy in white. The blade then disappeared in a flash. Feng Qingbai shrugged his left shoulder which was aching with bone-piercing pain after being struck by Chan Ping'an's vicious kick. However, this wouldn't affect his combat power. He brought the index finger and middle finger of his right hand together, forming a sword seal. The mystical powers of sword cultivators couldn't be used in this small and constrained world. However, Feng Qingbai had already perfected the lesser technique of performing sword kinesis and manipulating his blade. Feng Qingbai had entered this blessed land for the sake of tempering his sword. He was using every method at his disposal to temper his sword intent and sword heart. The attacker and the defender switched roles. A ball of snow white and a streak of dazzling white danced around the alley. Elsewhere, Zhou Shi carefully helped Yura up before propping her in a sitting position against a nearby wall. This would prevent her from being accidentally killed by Chan Ping'an's fist aura and Feng Qingbai's sword qi. Feng Qingbai's sword strike which had pierced through Yura's back had truly been intense and vicious, and it had directly severed Yura's connection to her dantian. Not only that, but a wisp of sword qi remained in her body, preventing her from channeling her qi to heal her wounds. If no powerful elite came to extract that wisp of sword qi from her body and save her, then Yura would have no option but to wait for death. Even the sagely medicines from Vajra Temple were powerless against this wisp of sword qi. Zhou Shi naturally didn't get lovey-dovey with her, while an intense battle was taking place nearby. Squatting in the shadows of the wall, he applied some extra force with his thumb and pushed a prayer bead out from the string of prayer beads wrapped around his fist. The sanguine prayer bead didn't fall to the ground and roll away, and it instead bounced on the paved alley twice before vanishing into thin air. Zhou Shi continued to scatter prayer beads onto the ground. This was a defensive treasure that his father, Zhou Fei, had given him. If used properly, This string of prayer beads could keep him alive even if he were facing off against one of the upper 10 elites. Meanwhile, this string of prayer beads would allow him to directly kill those who were lower 10 elites. Of course, Zhou Shi's father, the palace leader of Springtide Palace, had also warned him to flee if he could should he come across Ding Ying or Yu Zhani. If he couldn't flee, then it wouldn't be embarrassing or shameful for him to kneel, kowtow, and beg for mercy. Feng Qingbai appeared calm and relaxed as he slowly walked forward, controlling his sword with his mind in a skillful manner as he hunted down the young boy in white. Chen Ping'an attempted to break free several times, yet he was eventually caught and attacked by the flying sword each time. The flying sword was so quick that one could only see the streaks of sword light that it left in the air. Smiley Face didn't dare to complicate things by trying to help, so he silently composed himself and adjusted his breathing. At the same time, he both breathed a sigh of relief and felt a sense of fear. After witnessing this exchange and seeing Feng Qingbai's true power, just what should he do if he were to battle against Feng Qingbai? The young boy in white, dashing around like a fluttering snowflake, suddenly came to a stop and grabbed at the hilt of Feng Qingbai's flying sword. However, Feng Qingbai was completely unfazed as he said, "How can it be so simple? You definitely can't grab." Before Feng Qingbai could even finish speaking, Chen Ping'an grabbed the hilt of Feng Qingbai's flying sword with his right hand and struck its blade with his left palm. The blade didn't shatter, but its tip curled up significantly as the entire blade deformed. Feng Qingbai's 2 fingers forming the sword seal faltered slightly. Chen Ping'an also held his index finger and middle finger together, forming a sword seal and rapidly running it over the blade of the sword, straightening it out perfectly. He held the sword horizontally in front of him before releasing his grip. While Feng Qingbai was standing there transfixed with astonishment, someone grabbed the back of his collar and forcefully dragged him back, throwing him more than 30 meters back. The tip of the flying sword had only been a hair away from piercing Feng Qingbai's heart. Chen Ping'an moved his fingers slightly, causing the flying sword to return and fly around him like an obedient little bird. A sword expert's ability to perform sword kinesis? I'm capable of that too. Not only was Feng Qingbai's flying sword snatched, but he was almost stabbed in the heart by his own weapon as well after Chen Ping'an used his sword kinesis skills. However, Feng Qingbai didn't feel humiliated by this, nor did he flare up in rage. Instead, a glimmer appeared in his eyes as he finally started to become a little interested in the situation. It was still necessary to somewhat adhere to the customs of the cultivation world. So Feng Qingbai expressed his gratitude to Lu Feng, as he stood behind the extremely renowned pseudo-sword immortal who had saved him. Feng Qingbai felt slightly envious as he looked at the carefree man whose sleeves were brimming with sword qi. Feng Qingbai had only attained his power and reached such a height thanks to his background and his master. Even though his talent was indeed outstanding, it couldn't be considered peerless or as rare as one in 100 years. However, Lu Feng was different. Lu Feng would be a top-notch swordsman no matter which world he existed in. With his back to Feng Qingbai, Lu Feng smiled and said, "You're welcome. If you want, I can continue to support you from the sidelines. However, the prerequisite is that you have the courage to snatch your flying sword back first." Feng Qingbai massaged his left shoulder in slight exasperation before shaking his head and replying, "This naturally wouldn't be difficult in the outside world. However, it's impossible for me to snatch my sword back in this world." Lu Feng nodded and said, "Then you can observe the battle from nearby in a moment. I'll definitely repay you for your help," Feng Qingbai said with a smile. After abandoning his identity as a sword cultivator, he had possessed the body of someone with passable aptitude, and started from the beginning as a pure martial artist and sword practitioner in the cultivation world. He had challenged elites from all over the world, and this had indeed been very beneficial. However, it was still far from enough to help Feng Qingbai reach the state of so-called, from far to near, that his master had mentioned. Before entering the Blessed Land, Feng Qingbai had engaged in a lengthy discussion with his master. Apart from the sword by their waist, sword cultivators also possess bonded flying swords in order to launch attacks from far away. This was the concept of far. They could silently kill people even if their targets were hundreds or thousands of meters away. Meanwhile, sword practitioners from the cultivation world focused on becoming invincible within a range of 1 meter. This was the concept of near. Right now, Feng Qingbai was trying to comprehend sword Dao pertaining to the concept of near. Fortunately, watching Lu Feng and that young boy in white do battle with their swords was also a form of cultivation. Feng Qingbai possessed the observation skills and disposition to do this. As for whether they won or lost today, Feng Qingbai didn't care too much about this. In reality, the large majority of otherworldly immortals hadn't come to this world to seek invincibility or dominance. Instead, most of them had come here to temper their minds. Yer was drenched in sweat as she limply rested against the wall, and she had just barely managed to avoid the pitiful fate of having her blood gush out like a fountain. In fact, she didn't even dare to look down at her wound. The people woman who had been smashed into the wall had her face caked in blood as she struggled hard and finally managed to fall to the ground with much difficulty. She rested her back against the wall, and she summoned her strength to slowly stand up bit by bit. She glanced at her adored Pipa, a companion which had accompanied her through the cultivation world for many years. It was already broken and tattered, and she no longer had the strength to pick it back up. She didn't so much as glance at the battle in the alley, and she instead used the wall as a support as she slowly walked forward. The face of the pitiful woman was deathly pale, and it looked as if she were intent on walking to some certain place. Ma Xian was still yet to regain consciousness. It was entirely possible that he might never regain consciousness. Beads of sweat formed on Zhou Shi's forehead, and just glancing at the young boy in white's ability to perform sword kinesis out of the corners of his eyes was enough to make him feel a colossal weight on his shoulders. He felt suffocated and barely able to breathe. Scattering the prayer beads onto the ground and having them take root wasn't easy. Zhou Shi needed to sever wisps of his vital energy before extracting them from his body and carefully funneling them into the prayer beads. Afterward, he needed to follow the immortal formation layout that his father, Zhou Fei, had privately taught him. This formation layout was called Dragon Slayer, and the prayer beads needed to be set up as if he were setting up a specific Go formation. Only then would the formation be complete. Not a single mistake could be made during the process, and each prayer bead was filled with immortal qi that Zhou Fei had collected from all over the world. Zhou Fei had once asked his son to wield a divine weapon and attack the prayer beads as he pleased, yet Zhou Shi had failed to cause any damage to the prayer beads. After arriving at the capital of Southern Garden Nation with his father this time, Zhou Shi had initially thought that victory was firmly within their grasp. As such, he had felt like he was here to watch a show. He simply needed to hide behind his father and old demon Ding as he watched the others duke it out and fight to the death. However, Dinging hadn't acted according to Zhou Shi's expectations, so Zhou Shi had eventually been forced into perilous danger along with Yer. His father still possessed the ability to revive and turn the tables even if he were killed. However, this was not the case for Zhou Shi. If he were killed, then it would be immensely difficult and bordering on impossible for him to regather his soul and return to the outside world as the complete and original Zhou Shi. Moreover, his father's temperament was such that he might not even look at his son's corpse if Zhou Shi were to be killed before their plan came to fruition. Zhou Fei definitely wouldn't spend any extra effort on his son. The reason why Chen Ping'an wasn't driving home his advantage in relentlessly attacking his opponents was partly due to Lu Feng's interference. In addition, however, he was also familiarizing himself with the weight of his newly obtained flying sword as well as the true qi he needed to expend in order to control its movements. The more precise his movements, the better. When it came to sword kinesis performed by sword experts, the ability to control one's sword as if it were an extension of one's arm was only the most elementary skill. The most important skill was to control one's sword through tacit understanding, and this was a pseudo-ability that emulated the ability of sword cultivators to control their bonded flying swords. This was similar to copies and rubbings of texts, where the copies and rubbings would also possess some true intent even though they were rough and inferior. The pseudo-abilities of sword experts also possessed profound skill and power. In reality, Lu Feng was feeling very hesitant the entire time. This was because old demon Ding was nearby. If he chose to face the young boy in white with his full strength, he would completely open himself up to a swift and violent surprise attack from the eccentric Ding Ying. Ding Ying never cared about his identity or the rules of this world when he acted, so it wouldn't be surprising even if he unleashed his full strength against an unremarkable and low-level martial artist. In addition, Lu Feng was worried about the safety of Zhou Shi. At this moment, Lu Feng and Qian Ping'an looked toward the same place in unison. There was a tall and skinny elder in azure Confucian robes walking in a proper and dignified manner. He was clearly one of the most powerful grandmasters in this world, yet he didn't interfere with Qian Ping'an and Lu Feng's battle as he turned from the street and walked into an alley. He walked to Qian Ping'an's temporary residence. Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu was facing off against Ding Ying. If there were someone in the world who dared to face old Demon Ding head-on with their fists and were further able to rival his power, willing to fight to the death without retreating, then this person wouldn't be immortal Yu Zhenyi, whose power was vaguely superior to the martial arts orthodoxy of this world. This person definitely wouldn't be Bird's Eye View Peak's Lu Feng either. Instead, it could only be Zhongqiu. Upon seeing this, Lu Feng knew that he no longer needed to hold back. There was nothing stopping him anymore. Lu Feng slowly unsheathed his sword, Dachuan, with an inch of dazzling light appearing in the world with each inch of his sword that he unsheathed. This light was so blinding that even Smiley Face needed to squint his eyes. The skinny little girl who dearly hoped that no one would notice her was sitting tucked up on the stool the entire time. When Smiley Face squinted his eyes, however, she instead widened her eyes to carefully observe the dazzling sword light as it grew inch by inch. She didn't turn away or close her eyes even as tears started to stream down her face. Only when Dachuan was halfway out of its scabbard did she suddenly turn her head, feeling as if she were about to become blind. Even after closing her eyes, her vision was still filled with a vast expanse of snow white. She raised her little hands, which were as skinny as chicken feet, and used them to wipe away her tears. Why had she stared so intently at that person drawing his sword? This was simply because she felt like that scene was very impressive and attractive. As such, she had wanted to grab that scene with both hands. When she walked along the streets filled with fragrance coming from the breakfast stalls in the morning, she would always look at the various types of delicacies in the steamers with thirst in her eyes and drool in her mouth. She would always want to snatch the food and run, hiding somewhere to stuff her belly before throwing away what she couldn't finish. It would be best if no one else could eat this food. It would be best if they all died of starvation and pissed off. Zhongqiu arrived outside Qian Ping'an's temporary residence. The gate to the courtyard wasn't closed, so he decided to directly walk inside. Upon seeing the strongest martial artist in the world, one who had cultivated the fist techniques of external martial arts to a pinnacle state, Ding Ying smiled faintly and said, "It's been 60 years since we last met. If we take this into account, just how old are you this year, Zhongqiu?" 70-something. Zhongqiu glanced at the scenes outside the window, and he observed the commotion coming from the side room. He furrowed his brows. Ding Ying stood on the steps, and he didn't feel any frustration toward Zhongqiu's silence. He continued to speak, asking, "You didn't believe me back then, but do you believe me now?" Ding Ying had seen everything in the world after traveling through the cultivation world for more than 100 years. Few people were worthy in his eyes, and of this measly number of people, several had already died. Zhongqiu was one of these worthy people. Everyone in the world held Yu Zhenyi in extremely high regard. Even though Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu of Southern Garden Nation was also very lofty in their eyes, he was still slightly inferior to immortal Yu Zhenyi, who was at the peak of the mountains and close to the sea of clouds. However, Ding Ying had always looked down on Yu Zhenyi. He only appreciated and acknowledged Zhongqiu. Ding Ying had been a key member of the chaotic battle in Southern Garden Nation 60 years ago, while Yu Zhenyi and Zhongqiu had merely been youths who had obtained fated opportunities by chance during that time. After the chaotic battle finished, Ding Ying had coincidentally come across the two good friends who were always by each other's side one time, and remarked that Zhongqiu would definitely become the grandmaster of a region in the future. Standing in Qian Ping'an's temporary residence, Zhongqiu asked Ding Ying two questions. "What are you planning to do? What are we doing right now? Let's sit down and have a chat," Ding Ying said as he sat down on a small stool. He casually waved his hand and made another small stool hover over to Zhongqiu's side. After Zhongqiu took a seat, Ding Ying slowly said, "Before answering your two questions, let me ask you this first. Do you know where we are right now? A world exists beyond our world." Zhongqiu replied with a solemn expression. Ding Ying nodded and explained, "Compared to the clues and traces about otherworldly immortals that you people have discovered in the secret texts, my understanding of them is relatively more direct. I've killed quite a few otherworldly immortals during the past 60 years, some of them already aware of their identities and some of them still yet to regain their memories. I obtained many answers and much information from them." He stomped his foot on the ground and continued. "The world we live in is called the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, one of the 72 blessed lands. We feel like the territory of the 4 nations and the undeveloped desolate lands is extremely vast. Yet the otherworldly immortals who descend into our world all find it incredibly small. According to them, the Lotus Flower Blessed Land can only be considered a medium-grade blessed land. When they determine the grade of a blessed land, the abundance of spiritual energy in the world is naturally very important. However, the population of the world is also very important. In reality, the Lotus Flower Blessed Land isn't very big in terms of land size. However, martial arts prodigies appear in abundance in this world. So this is therefore a very ideal location for otherworldly immortals to temper their minds." Even though Zhong Qiu had sought the truth for many years and already had some speculations, his impervious mind as a grandmaster was still affected when he heard Ding Ying personally reveal the truth. A hint of fury spread across his face. It was only at this moment that Zhong Qiu finally started to understand the immense pressure on Eugenie. After cultivating immortal techniques, Eugenie was able to stand higher and see further than anyone else apart from Ding Ying. Thus, he felt a sense of complete indifference toward the conflicts in the cultivation world, and even the tumultuous changes in the imperial courts of the 4 nations. This was a sense of indifference that other people couldn't fathom or understand. Ding Ying smiled and continued. "However, the truly strange thing about this Lotus Flower Blessed Land is the existence of..." Ding Ying couldn't help but chuckle at this point, looking up at the sky and saying, "A person? An immortal?" He continued to explain the situation, saying, "I've heard that entering our blessed land is far more difficult than entering the other blessed lands. If someone wants to enter, they need to rely on that person's mood or that person's first impression of them. In the world of those otherworldly immortals, Parasol Leaf Continent's Lotus Flower Blessed Land isn't very famous compared to the Cloud Cave Blessed Land controlled by a sect called Jade Tablet Sect. There are few legends about our blessed land. People like Zhou Fei and Lu Feng are descendants from influential clans who are working as officials outside the city, and they're advancing their political careers step by step in a relatively conventional manner. However, these people are the minority, and those who accidentally wandered into our blessed land make up the majority. It's down to luck whether the latter group of people can make it back out." Zhong Qiu pointed at the sky and asked, "In other words, the world beyond our world is called Parasol Leaf Continent?" There was an amused and meaningful smile on Ding Ying's face as he replied, "Who told you that it's definitely above us?" Zhong Qiu mulled over this in silence. It was rare for Ding Ying to come across someone worth talking to, so he didn't radiate with the unruly pride and haughtiness of the #1 grandmaster of this world at this moment. Instead, he appeared like an extremely patient old teacher educating his disciple and answering his disciple's questions. "I can answer your second question now. What are we doing right now? Every 60 years, those who become upper 10 elites and survive until the end will be chosen by that person and be allowed to leave this world. Not only that, but these people will all receive huge fated opportunities, with a high-level fated opportunity allowing them to ascend with their complete physical body and soul. On the other hand, those who receive a low-level fated opportunity can only ascend with their soul. Is this why the Reverence Pagoda does everything in its ability to determine the genuine upper 10 elites, even if it means going to extremes?" Zhong Qiu asked. "Are they trying to prevent people from falsifying their powers to undeservedly enter the rankings? At the same time, they're also preventing people from hiding their powers too much? Because of this, those rare treasures that can help one's cultivation base advance in leaps and bounds have been purposely added to this world. Not only that, but there's also the rule stating that one can obtain a divine weapon, as long as one manages to kill an otherworldly immortal. Perhaps the purpose of all this is to draw the top 20 elites together, and have them battle and kill each other. In terms of the Reverence Pagoda that's inciting trouble and creating confusion, there are far more internal secrets than we can imagine. The world wouldn't be so chaotic if it weren't for the Reverence Pagoda's so-called warning once every 20 years. Ding Ying chuckled and continued. "However, there are actually loopholes that we can take advantage of." Zhong Qiu lived up to his name as the Imperial Preceptor of Southern Garden Nation, and he immediately understood Ding Ying's implicature, saying, "The strong get stronger, and they gather together to take advantage of their strength. They strive to work together such that they can reap all of the rewards and share the spoils in the end." Eugenie is doing exactly this right now. He's trying to win over members of the upper 10 elites and lower 10 elites irrespective of whether these people are good or evil. His aim is to target you as well as those otherworldly immortals. Zhong Qiu frowned after saying this, and he looked at Ding Ying as if slightly puzzled. Ding Ying laughed heartily and said, "Your line of thought is correct. The safest and most reliable method is for the upper 10 elites to understand the situation and side with me, seeking my protection. The world can enjoy peace for at least the current 60 years if I leave the demonic force, treat everyone with fairness, act in a cautious and conscientious manner, and establish a set of rules for everyone. That way, everyone can compete according to their own abilities and talents, with me being the final judge on where everyone should rank. For example, I'll determine your ranking, and I'll also determine whether Eugenie has entered the top 3. If this is the case, then there's naturally no need for everyone to fight to the death and spill so much blood. Just sparring with each other would be enough." Zhong Qiu carefully pondered over this, eventually confirming that Ding Ying wasn't overestimating his abilities and spouting nonsense. Ding Ying lightly tapped his knees with his fingers, appearing especially relaxed and carefree as he added, "However, I felt would be very uninteresting. What are you planning to do?" Zhong Qiu asked, repeating his first question again. Ding Ying waved his hand and ignored this question again, changing the topic and saying, "You have to understand that the situation is different this time. The concept of upper 10 elites and lower 10 elites doesn't exist anymore, and the 3 people who survive until the end and ascend from this world will be able to bring 5 people, 3 people, and 1 person from this world with them respectively. Anyone can be brought from this world," Ding Ying emphasized. Zhong Qiu was unfazed. Ding Ying pursed his lips and added, "Even deceased individuals can be brought out from this world, as long as they're people who have genuinely existed. If deceased individuals are chosen, they'll revive and regain their full consciousness, yet they'll still become something akin to loyal puppets. Isn't this very interesting?" The images of several people instantly flashed past Zhong Qiu's mind. There was Wei Xian, the founding emperor of Southern Garden Nation, divinely skilled with the spear. He was regarded as the most skilled martial artist of the past 1,000 years when it came to breaking enemy ranks. There was Liu Baixiang, the demonic cultivator who had founded the demonic forces and enjoyed the greatest notoriety of anyone in the past 500 years. There was sword immortal Sui Yubian, someone whom even Eugenie admired greatly. Of course, there was also Zhu Lian, an absolute maniac and the strongest person in the Lotus Flower-blessed land prior to Ding Ying. These people had undisputedly been the most powerful cultivators during their time. Without exception, however, all 4 of them had already passed away. There was sufficient proof of this. Emperor Wei Xian had died of old age at 120 years old. Liu Baixiang had been surrounded and killed by dozens of top-notch elites. Sui Yubian had attempted to ascend from the world on her sword under the watchful gazes of everyone, yet plummeted back to earth with her flesh melting and her bones disintegrating in the process. And Zhu Lian had died at Ding Ying's hands after suffering severe wounds during some previous conflict. In fact, Ding Ying had grabbed the silver-colored lotus flower hat from Zhu Lian's head and taken it for himself. "You're asking me, but who should I ask?" Ding Ying replied with a smile. Zhong Qiu looked straight into Ding Ying's eyes and said, "You, Zhou and Lu Feng, that's 3 people already. And that's why you have 2 choices now. You can either kill Lu Feng or you can ally with Eugenie and attempt to kill me." Ding Ying chuckled. Zhong Qiu remained silent. "However, I suggest that you wait for a little longer," Ding Ying said in amusement. "Perhaps someone else will kill Lu Feng for you. Who will you bring from this world if you ascend and leave?" Zhong Qiu asked. Ding Ying pointed at Chao Qinglang, who was standing at the doorway of the kitchen, and replied, "I'll only bring him if I choose to leave." Zhong Qiu glanced at the little boy and said in confusion, "His aptitude isn't anything special." Ding Ying dismissed this with a smile. No longer constrained by anything, Lu Feng unleashed his first genuine sword strike. When he completed his motion, an extremely long ditch that measured 1.5 meters deep appeared from his position all the way to the end of the street. To say nothing of Yer and Zhou, people who were native to this world, even Feng Qingbai was completely stunned. It was as if he had returned to his hometown, Parasol Leaf Continent. The smiling face of Smiley Face became even more animated. It was easier to relax under the shade of big trees. Thanks to the strings of fate and destiny, Smiley Face had become friends with Lu Feng during the latter's most troubled times. Back then, the impulsive Smiley Face had recklessly accompanied Lu Feng to Springtide Palace, essentially choosing a gallant death in the context of that time. However, Lu Feng had knocked Smiley Face unconscious at the foot of the mountain and gone ahead to challenge Zhou Fei by himself. When Smiley Face had regained consciousness, Lu Feng had already been sitting by his side, no longer a dejected person who always drank wine to wash away his sorrows. For many years afterward, Smiley Face was the only person who could visit Lu Feng's bird's-eye view peak and leave the mountain alive. In any case, Zhou Shi was feeling the most exasperated out of everyone present. Now that Lu Feng was fighting without constraint, wouldn't that render the formation that he had set up with so much difficulty completely useless? The battle was progressing smoothly, and the only disappointment was that the young sword practitioner in white had surprisingly chosen to flee. It was as if Chen Ping'an had confirmed that he couldn't block his opponent's attack the instant that Lu Feng had unleashed his sword strike. Chen Ping'an had shuffled sideways before directly crashing through a wall and disappearing without a trace. Lu Feng looked around, convinced that Chen Ping'an was still lurking in the surroundings. He swung his sword down in a seemingly casual manner, causing a large hole to immediately appear in the wall. Plumes of dust rose into the air, and a fleeting glimpse of white was vaguely visible as Chen Ping'an dodged the torrent of sword chi that was powerful like a tsunami. However, he quickly vanished again after evading his opponent's attack. Lu Feng was well aware that neither of them could injure each other if things continued to drag on. His destructive power was superior to his opponent, yet the young boy in white was able to dodge all of his attacks. Nothing would change unless one of them decided to go all out and fight with their life on the line. For example, if Lu Feng retracted half of his sword chi to give Chen Ping'an an opportunity to approach him. Or for example, if Chen Ping'an were willing to take a huge gamble and push through Lu Feng's offensive and defensive sword attack, after which he would have the opportunity to kill Lu Feng with a single punch. Lu Feng swung his sword upward. A gigantic burst of crescent-shaped sword chi materialized in the air and surged forward. A dash of white hurriedly ground to a halt and stopped charging forward, rapidly diving down instead. Only then was it able to dodge the deadly arc of sword chi. Lu Feng jumped onto the wall with a graceful leap. The young boy had dodged his attack several times, yet he hadn't used the sword that he had snatched from Feng Qingbai a single time. This was quite strange. Lu Feng saw Chen Ping'an standing on the curved eaves of a roof in the distance. The young boy's large sleeves were fluttering a little, and combined with that vermilion wine gourd by his waist, he didn't appear just otherworldly and ethereal. His abundant and concentrated fist aura resonated with heaven and earth, appearing both formidable yet nimble at the same time. This was very difficult to achieve. Even Lu Feng, who was widely renowned in Parasol Leaf Continent, had to admit that this young otherworldly immortal with a mishmash of martial arts skills would definitely reach great heights in the future, if he were able to leave the lotus flower-blessed land alive. Since Chen Ping'an wasn't biting his bait, he would simply change his tactic and cast a large net instead. Lu Feng raised his arm and flourished his sword. Apart from the sword in his hand, there were another 36 swords identical to Dachuan hovering in front of him, orderly and creating a tight guard like soldiers standing in formation. The 36 swords slowly hovered forward before suddenly speeding up and slicing through the air. Chen Ping'an sprinted across the rooftops, spinning and jumping as numerous streaks of white sword chi exploded around him like parasitic enemies. Apart from controlling the 36 bursts of sword chi and using them as arrows, Lu Feng also continued to advance during suitable moments whenever Chen Ping'an tried to increase the distance between them. He maintained a distance of 90 meters between himself and his opponent, far enough to prevent Chen Ping'an from suddenly rushing over in a single burst but close enough to entice him to try. Lu Feng naturally wasn't playing a game of cat and mouse with Chen Ping'an. He was inviting Chen Ping'an to attack, and he was setting up a trap whereby every opportunity the young boy saw to advance and deliver the decisive punch would be predetermined and fraught with dangers. However, Chen Ping'an started to sprint toward Lu Feng before he could consume all 36 bursts of sword chi. Chen Ping'an's footsteps were nimble and unpredictable, and he didn't rush toward Lu Feng in a straight line. Lu Feng was slightly astonished. "You're charging over already?" He chuckled coldly in his mind. His fingers moved a little, and the final 6 bursts of sword chi suddenly separated and drew arcs in the air before their tips eventually converged together at a single point. That point was coincidentally a location where Qian Pingan's fist had to pass. There was a flash, and the 6 bursts of sword chi collided together and unleashed a deafening explosion behind Qian Pingan. Sure enough, the young boy could still move quicker. However, Lu Feng wasn't surprised at all. He didn't panic either. The sword in his hand, the genuine Dachuan, slashed horizontally forward. His sword chi converged into a thread. It was as if this slash directly split the capital of Southern Garden Nation into 2, a top layer and a bottom layer. Qian Pingan advanced instead of retreating, boldly pressing forward with indomitable will as he threw a punch at that thread-like sword light. Blood splashed through the air. There was apathy in Lu Feng's eyes as he slashed down. After splitting the space in front of him into top and bottom, he was now splitting it into left and right. However, it was also at this moment that Lu Feng relied purely on his instinct to shuffle across the roof. A flying sword whooshed past overhead, flying toward Qian Pingan from the direction where his back had been facing just then. There was lingering apprehension in Lu Feng's mind. Qian Pingan had definitely kept Feng Qingbai's sword near the wall the entire time. The young boy had appeared quite reckless when blocking Lu Feng's slash, yet his intention hadn't been to punch Lu Feng or the sword at all. Instead, he was manipulating Feng Qingbai's sword like a sword expert and attempting to attack Lu Feng from 2 sides. Qian Pingan reached out and grabbed the sword. He had almost pierced Lu Feng's heart just then. However, there was no sense of disappointment on his face as he quietly said in his mind, "Go." Lu Feng was overcome with shock, and he had no time to shout a warning at Zhou Shi or do anything else as he hurriedly chased after the sword and threw Dachuan toward the wall. Lu Feng used genuine sword kinesis this time, controlling his sword with his mind to prevent any accident from occurring again. He didn't want to kill his ally by accident when attempting to save him. Feng Qingbai's sword pierced through the wall and continued toward the back of Zhou Shi's head. At almost the exact same moment, Lu Feng's sword flew diagonally into the wall and crashed down toward the sword controlled by Qian Pingan. This was a critical moment, and Dachuan viciously slammed into Feng Qingbai's sword and caused it to dip slightly, eventually piercing through Zhou Shi's shoulder instead of his head. However, the powerful momentum of the strike still caused Zhou Shi to stumble forward. Lu Feng suddenly looked up. A streak of white was plummeting down like a meteor, shooting past the hole in the roof and throwing a punch at him. Lu Feng was sent sliding back by the punch, crashing through the wall as the second punch arrived. This was the deity drumming technique. Lu Feng was directly struck by Qian Pingan's deity drumming technique 9 times, and forced to retreat in a straight line again and again. In fact, Lu Feng even crashed through and obliterated the wall that Smiley Face and Qian Pingan had been standing on just then. Lu Feng attempted to summon his sword, Dachuan, to rescue him. However, he quickly discovered that he didn't have the courage to do this. He couldn't split his attention, and he could only gather all of his energy to defend himself. Moreover, Dachuan was only a divine weapon from this world, and it wasn't his bonded flying sword which he had left in Parasol Leaf Continent. Qian Pingan resolutely threw the 10th punch. Lu Feng crashed through the building on the opposite end of the street, suffering the same fate as the Peepa woman from before. He finally came to a stop and became embedded in some wall, appearing especially disheveled as blood flowed from all orifices on his face. However, Qian Pingan also paid a price for stubbornly throwing this punch. Someone appeared beside Qian Pingan and punched him in the temple. It was as if his head had been struck by a large bell. Qian Pingan flew more than 30 meters back before landing on his haunches. Next to him was the deep ditch that had been blasted into the ground by Lu Feng's powerful sword chi just then. The person who had interrupted Qian Pingan's deity drumming technique stood still with one hand behind his back and one hand clenched into a fist and held in front of him. Dressed in azure Confucian robes, he appeared especially calm and composed. Qian Pingan turned his head and spat out a mouthful of blood. He then raised a hand and wiped the corners of his mouth. The skinny little girl was coincidentally located between Qian Pingan and the imperial preceptor of Southern Garden Nation at this moment, and she remained quietly curled up on the small stool in front of the wall the entire time. She secretly stole a glance at that boy dressed in white. He was indeed powerful and impressive, but he also appeared slightly pitiful at this moment. Perhaps she was imagining things, but she felt like the boy who had told her to sit here and stay still, and who was slowly standing up in misery after being punched, was gazing at her at the same time that he was gazing at that old geezer who looked like a teacher from some private school. Perhaps he was telling her not to be afraid? She clearly understood that her survival was tied to his. If the young boy in white died, then she would most likely be killed as well. However, she still couldn't help but develop evil thoughts, eagerly hoping that he would be smashed to death by that old bastard. Her feelings at this moment couldn't be explained. This was the same as when she had seen that miniature snowman in the small wooden box before. She liked it very much, but since she couldn't obtain it, she would rather throw it to the ground, destroy it, and kill it once and for all. She didn't feel was wrong. Zhou Shi had only just finished retrieving all of his prayer beads when two flying swords had smashed through the wall and severely wounded him. Immediately afterward, Feng, who had initially enjoyed an overwhelming advantage over Chen Ping'an, had been pushed back to the street by a relentless flurry of punches from the young boy, with the final punch sending him flying backward and causing him to become embedded in a wall. And now, Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu from Southern Garden Nation had come to finish the fight. Zhongqiu was widely regarded as the strongest individual in this world, and his act of punching the young boy and pushing him back was equivalent to saving Feng, who was already unable to defend himself. Feng Qingbai seized this opportunity to retrieve his sword. Not only that, but had also been looking for an opportunity to retrieve Dachuan and return it to Feng the entire time. However, Zhongqiu's sudden appearance discouraged Feng Qingbai from doing this, lest he complicate the situation. Feng Qingbai exhaled a long breath. If Zhongqiu's punch had struck his temple instead, then he would have most likely needed to rely on his master to offer up wealth to get him out of this world. Otherwise, he could only reincarnate again and again in the lotus flower-blessed land, continually eroding his fundamental nature as a cultivator. He would eventually be fused into this world. This was the concept of heaven and earth being a furnace and all matter in between being molten metal. 1. Meanwhile, the child assistant of that person was responsible for fanning the flames. That person never showed himself, and he seemed unwilling to interact with the world. Only a young child holding a plantain fan was responsible for looking after the lotus flower-blessed land. Of course, he would also interact and communicate with the various parties who had the right to know about the lotus flower-blessed land. Before entering this blessed land, Feng Qingbai had followed the founder of the force he belonged to and seen that young child. At the time, even the founder, an unpolished jade-tier cultivator, had treated the young child as an equal. This was even though the young child had spoken in a very blunt and aggressive manner. Feng Qingbai had a vague and instinctual feeling that the tempering of his great Tao and his sword heart had already reached a limit. If he were fortunate enough, he would at most obtain a valuable tool, the second weakest type of immortal treasure. After all, his combat power was still intact at this moment, unlike Feng, who had already lost the ability to fight. In fact, Feng might have even suffered damage to his Tao heart. This would be extremely troublesome even after he returned to Parasol Leaf Continent. The title of otherworldly immortal was very impressive and beautiful. In reality, however, this was far from being the case. Only Zhou Fei, who promoted the ideology that if one doesn't enjoy life, then one is no different from plants and livestock, could be described as otherworldly. He had never attempted to temper his cultivation in this world, and he had instead lived a relaxed and carefree life. However, this world was riddled with dangers for people like Feng Qingbai, Feng, and the others. Even though their senior, Tong Qingqing, was already the esteemed leader of the Mirror Heart Hall and one of the 4 grandmasters of the world, she had still been in hiding for several decades and was still yet to show herself at this moment. She was the perfect example of how they needed to hide from danger. Feng Qingbai pushed these random thoughts out of his mind and started to review the battle just then. He tried his best to draw some lessons and conclusions. He had watched the battle between top-notch elites from a distance just then, and he had attempted to temper his mind in the same vein that one could borrow stones from another mountain to polish jade. Though a different method to the Buddhist practice of meditation, it led to much the same results. In reality, Feng Qingbai viewed this top-level battle in the Lotus Flower-blessed land as no inferior to those battles between Golden Core tier cultivators and nascent tier cultivators in Parasol Leaf Continent. The battle between Lu Feng and the young boy in white was already so spectacular, so just how magnificent would a battle between Ding Ying and Eugenie be, one evil and one good? Feng Qingbai initially hadn't placed much hope in Qian Ping'an because Lu Feng was a renowned sword cultivator from Parasol Leaf Continent. After overcoming numerous challenges and suppressions, Lu Feng was able to advance against the flow and carve out his own path, once again reaching the doorway to the sword Dao in the Lotus Flower-blessed land where spiritual energy was scant. Lu Feng was extremely skilled with the sword, able to attack at a distance but also defend at close range. However, the result was beyond Feng Qingbai's expectations. The decisive factor rested in the fact that Qian Ping'an discovered that Lu Feng would save Zhou Shi no matter what. According to rumors spread in the cultivation world, Lu Feng and Zhou Fei were mortal enemies, with Lu Feng once climbing the mountain to the Spring Tide Palace with his sword and challenging Zhou Fei to a life-and-death battle. There was no way this could have been faked. Feng Qingbai had already been in the Lotus Flower-blessed land for a dozen or so years, while that young boy in white had only arrived not long ago. Theoretically speaking, Qian Ping'an should have been far more unfamiliar with this world and the matters pertaining to the cultivators in the mountains. Feng Qingbai truly couldn't understand the current situation. Was it not the case that those closely involved in a situation would see less clearly than the bystanders? Perhaps that young boy hadn't just descended with his complete physical body and soul, but he was intimately familiar with many secrets of this world as well? And it was because of this that he had broken the rules and was now being viewed as a rebel by the heavenly Tao, one who needed to be subdued and executed? Zhou Shi was severely wounded, with his entire shoulder completely pulverized and in tatters. Fortunately, however, these were only flesh wounds. Using a sagely healing medicine formulated by Zhou Fei in Spring Tide Palace, Zhou Shi was able to just barely stop his bleeding. He leaned against the wall with a pitiful and somber smile on his face as he said, "I already tried my best." He was a talented and carefree young man who could attract blushes and shy smiles from countless beautiful women, yet it was a shame that he was no longer carefree at this moment. Instead, there was only despondence remaining on his face. Beside him, Yur was channeling a secret technique from the demonic force with all her power in order to suppress her chaotic flow of qi. This was a precious martial arts technique from the Hanging Flower faction, one of the three factions of the demonic orthodoxy. This secret technique could revive one's vitality, and it was said that one of the previous leaders of the Hanging Flower faction had tricked the Holy Maiden of the Mirror Heart Hall from that generation and thus succeeded in reading half of the Return to Simplicity true scripture through underhanded methods. This was a true scripture that allowed people to genuinely revert their age and return to youthhood. The leader of the Hanging Flower faction at that time had been an incredible prodigy, so they had unraveled the contents of the true scripture and transformed the knowledge into their own, eventually allowing them to create this secret technique for the demonic force. However, using this secret technique would also cause significant side effects. Even though one could forcefully suppress their severe wounds and stabilize their body, they would age rapidly during the process and accelerate the deterioration of their body. Because of this, powerful cultivators from the Hanging Flower faction would only use this secret technique if they were forced into a dead end in a life-and-death battle. Yur's expression was livid, and the hair in front of her ears surprisingly started to become pale white. Zhou Shi sighed when he saw this. If he handed Yor a copper mirror at this moment, would the girl most proud about her beauty directly fall to heretical ways? Perhaps consoling Yor, or perhaps consoling himself, Zhou Shi said. "Don't worry, my father will be here very soon. I'll be safe at that time so you won't die either." In front of some wall far away, a broken pipa lay on the ground all by itself. Its owner had already disappeared, though she left drops of blood on the ground every so often. When Qian Ping'an stood up, Feng Qingbai, who was holding a sword, Zhou Shi, who was slumped against the wall, and Smiley Face, who had gone over to check on Lu Feng's situation, all felt anxiety grip at their hearts. Lu Feng dragged himself out from the wall and lightly landed on the ground. His movements were unstable, and Smiley Face wanted to reach over to support him. However, Lu Feng lightly shook his head as he raised an arm, summoning his sword Dachuan back to his side. The sword sheathed itself in midair before being held against the ground like a cane again. Lu Feng's cultivation base had initially been lofty and profound in the context of the lotus flower-blessed land, yet it had now plummeted significantly after he was struck by 10 consecutive and relentless punches of the deity drumming technique. Lu Feng's physique wasn't outstanding, so his body and soul had almost been shattered by Chen Ping'an's vicious attacks. There was a dark look in Lu Feng's eyes as he turned to Smiley Face, whose real name was Qian Tang, and said, "Allow me to rest for a while. You can accompany me for a drink afterward." Smiley Face nodded with a somber expression. Just like the first time they had met, Lu Feng had become that dejected person once again. In addition to protecting Zhou Shi, Lu Feng had chosen to enter the battle first, because he felt an even greater need to fight for Smiley Face. This was because Smiley Face wasn't ranked among the upper 10 elites or lower 10 elites. Before coming to the capital of Southern Garden Nation, however, Lu Feng had said that he would bring Smiley Face to the outside world to show him genuine immortals who could ride on the wind. Even though Lu Feng's demeanor had been calm at that time, Smiley Face had felt the unique emotion and spirit radiating from the sword immortal from Bird's Eye View Peak. He could have felt this even if he were blind. The two of them left the street together. Before leaving, Lu Feng cupped his fists and thanked Zhong Qiu. He then turned to Zhou Shi and said, "You're on your own now." When they arrived at the wine shop run by that woman, the woman started to grumble and curse when she saw the person who had stolen that sword. Only after a lot of persuasion was Lu Feng able to bring 2 pots of the lowest quality wine to the table, slamming them down in annoyance. Smiley Face could barely contain his urge to slap that woman to death. Lu Feng retrieved a simple and ancient-looking ji from his sleeves and handed it to Smiley Face, saying in a solemn voice, "I might need to trouble you with 2 difficult tasks in the next 20 years. First, I want you to carry this item and find my reincarnated body. The qi will become boiling hot when it draws close to me, and this will allow you to sense my presence. Second, I want you to look for a sword called Chaoyuan. If we aren't forceful regarding this matter, then the sword might end up in someone else's hands like how Dachuan ended up with me." There was a surprised expression on Qian Tang's face. "I've already made up my mind," Lu Feng said. He didn't explain this any further, and he continued, "Take care of the qi, and make haste and immediately leave Southern Garden Nation after drinking these pots of wine. You'll only cause me to die quicker if you stay here." Smiley Face had never seen Lu Feng speak in such a solemn manner before, so he had no option but to carefully accept the qi and nod in agreement. Smiley Face glanced at his good friend after drinking his pot of wine in a somber mood. Yet Lu Feng simply said in a calm voice, "You don't need to do anything if you truly manage to find me. You definitely shouldn't teach me martial arts on purpose either." "I'll keep this in mind," Smiley Face replied. However, he was no longer smiling anymore, and he was instead choking back tears as he spoke. Lu Feng wasn't expressing such sadness at their parting, and he silently saw Smiley Face off from the wine shop before turning his gaze to someplace and sneering, "You can show yourself now. You can rely on your abilities to obtain my head." The head of an otherworldly immortal. A hunchbacked old man who looked to be around 80 years old walked out from around the corner, coughing as he did so. Smiley Face would definitely recognize this feeble-looking old man if he were still present. He was none other than the 8-armed deity, Shui Yuan, someone who had been squeezed out from the ranks of the upper 10 elites 20 years ago, and continued to decline, eventually ending up as the last ranked member of the lower 10 elites. He had once been targeted and pestered by Smiley Face for an entire year, causing him to become a laughingstock in the cultivation world. Lu Feng sighed in his mind. He hadn't imagined that the remark he had made in Bull Mountain would become a reality. Eugenie had secretly gathered many powerful elites at the time, making it expressly clear that he wanted to hunt down and kill the 4 otherworldly immortals: Ding Ying, Zhou Fei, Tong Qingqing, and Feng Qingbai. Lu Feng had smiled and jokingly asked whether he would be hunted and killed as well. Judging from the situation right now, the answer was already very clear. This might not have been Eugenie's initial plan and intention, but Eugenie's cold-blooded nature was such that he naturally wouldn't let slip this once-in-a-blue-moon opportunity now that Lu Feng was severely wounded and completely defeated. To have the sword immortal from Bird's Eye View Peak fall to such a miserable state. How heart-wrenching. I wouldn't have believed this if I weren't able to see it with my own 2 eyes. Shui Yuan cracked a grin as he taunted Lu Feng, revealing the fact that he was missing several teeth. He slowly walked toward the wine shop, and it was extremely difficult to fathom that he was the most powerful external martial artist in the world before Zhongqiu. How generous of you, Zhenny. He's willing to let you collect my head, Lu Feng chuckled. Shui Yuan stood in a hunchbacked posture as he stopped 20 paces away from the door of the wine shop, replying, Yu Zhenny is a deity of the current age, so he naturally has no interest in such a measly fated opportunity on mortal old man here. In any case, Great Sword Immortal Lu, you still have 30 to 40% of your strength remaining, so you still have some chance to defeat me, the aging Shui Yuan. Great Sword Immortal? Have you seen them before? Are you worthy to utter this title? Lu Feng sneered. Shui Yuan chuckled and replied, No, I'm not worthy at all. I'll listen you, Great Sword Immortal Lu. There was a look of ridicule in Lu Feng's eyes. Shui Yuan caught Lu Feng's gaze and shook his head. Afterward, the eight-armed deity shook his back and straightened his body like a flood dragon rearing its head, causing his aura to change drastically. This was the aura and disposition that a grandmaster should possess. There was a frighteningly dark expression on Shui Yuan's face as he flared up in rage, and his voice was dripping with accumulated resentment and fury as he spat. Haughty otherworldly immortals like you all deserve to die. That's right, that's the expression, the one in your eyes right now. You're like a phoenix that's already lost its feathers and become inferior to a chicken, yet you're still looking down on everyone else in the world with such a contemptuous expression. It's as if you view everyone as mere ants. Lu Feng didn't offer a response. However, he knew that this would be the last battle of his life. This wasn't satisfying enough. His battle with Chen Ping'an just then hadn't been satisfying, and his battle with Shui Yuan, who was kicking him while he was down, would be even more stifling. Yet, it was right at this moment when Shui Yuan had just cast away his disguise and descended upon Lu Feng like a deity that his body suddenly became rigid. His neck was held in a vice-like grip as he was slowly lifted into the air bit by bit. Shui Yuan was like a snake being held by its head, unable to even put up a fight. His feet rose higher and higher into the air. The person who had launched a surprise attack on the old man had a warm and mellow voice, and he chuckled. What's wrong with viewing you people as mere ants? I don't see anything wrong with this because you people are indeed nothing more than ants. There was an audible crack as Shui Yuan's neck was snapped in half, after which the assailant casually tossed him to the ground. The woman looking after the wine shop shrieked in a high-pitched voice, while the customers all screamed about murder as they jumped up and scattered like frightened birds. After Shui Yuan was tossed aside, one could see that the assailant was a handsome young man. Indeed, he was none other than Zhou Fei, who had just hurried over from the Vajra temple. Zhou Fei was holding the head of another person who had died a confused death, and he tossed the head toward Lu Feng, letting it roll across the ground and splatter blood everywhere. It was surprisingly the head of smiley-faced Qiantang. Zhou Fei casually tossed the small qi onto the ground as well. Lu Feng slowly squatted down and gently ran his hand over Qiantang's face, closing the eyes of his good friend. There was a dazed expression on Lu Feng's face as he stared at Smiley Face, and he didn't look at Zhou Fei, nor did he pick up his small qi. Instead, he simply asked in a quivering voice, Why? Zhou Fei remained silent for a moment before sidestepping the question and saying, Since when did you become such a sloppy and hesitant piece of trash, Lu Feng? You came here for the sake of overcoming the hurdle of mortal relationships, yet in the end, you failed to see through relationships, much less overcome them. So be it if this is the case, and you can simply return empty-handed if worse comes to worst. Yet, you're now unable to let go of this head of some person who's no better than some random stranger? Lu Feng, even if you return to Parasol Leaf Continent, I'm confident that you won't be able to maintain your nascent tier cultivation base, to say nothing of advancing to the upper 5 tiers. Zhou Fei squatted down and asked, Tell me, why did you come here? As the clan leader of Jade Tablet Sect's Zhang clan, why did I accompany you to the Lotus Flower Blessed Land and spend so many years here? At some unknown time, Lu Feng's sword, Dachuan, silently appeared on the ground as well, resting on the street alongside the small qi and a severed head. The stunningly beautiful ladies were standing far behind Zhou Fei, with some of them slender like willows and some of them shapely like rice grains in autumn. Why didn't you look for Zhou Shi first? Lu Feng looked up and asked. Zhou Fei chuckled in anger and replied, I can always have a new child if my son dies. However, Do you want me to waste another 60 years in the lotus flower-blessed land if you die here? Zhou Fei stood up and waved his hand, gesturing for a beautiful woman who was still quite charming to come over. Go, accompany your senior brother Lu, whom you respected so much back then, and have some wine with him. The two of you haven't met for so many years, so there's definitely a lot that you want to say to each other. The beautiful woman instantly became pale. Zhou Fei patted her cheek and said, Come on, be an obedient girl. The ground tremored as Zhou Fei vanished in a flash. Like birds spreading their wings, the flowing robes and colorful ribbons of the other ladies fluttered in the air as they also soared into the sky. This was a stunning scene that intoxicated the passers-by on the nearby streets. Lu Feng stood up and faced that woman who was both familiar yet unfamiliar, asking, Let's sit down and chat? The woman nodded in a fearful manner. The two of them sat opposite each other, yet Lu Feng discovered that the shopkeeper was still squatting behind the counter in terror. He stood up and grabbed 2 pots of wine himself. Before he could pour the wine, however, the woman who had stayed in Springtide Palace for many years and become accustomed to serving others hurriedly stood up and poured a bowl of wine for Lu Feng. Only then did she pour a bowl of wine for herself. Lu Feng didn't look at her face, one which had made him feel heartbreak in the past. Instead, he simply looked at her hands, which were as smooth and jade-like as those belonging to young girls, before lifting his bowl of wine with a smile. The beautiful woman breathed a soft sigh of relief. After contemplating for a moment, she stood up and walked to the street outside the wine shop, helping Lu Feng retrieve the small qi and dachuan. In fact, she even retrieved Smiley Face's head and placed it on another table in the wine shop. She then sat down and smiled at Lu Feng. With a bowl of wine in one hand, Lu Feng turned around to gaze at the empty street outside. It was as if he could see a young boy and a young girl, a match made in heaven, running around and playing happily with each other. 1. This symbolizes the fact that life is full of innate challenges that can't be avoided. 2. This means observing someone else or receiving someone else's criticism, and help to correct one's own mistakes and shortcomings. 3. The qi is an ancient Chinese center-blown transverse flute with closed ends and front finger holes. Zhanshan and Flying Dumplings thoughts. There are so many characters in this novel. It's hard to keep track and a bit confusing.